Hello, fellow sapiens, and welcome to Sleepless Homo. Take a moment to settle yourself. Maybe you're preparing to sleep, maybe you're cooking, showering, or working with headphones on. However you arrived here, let this be a place where you can quiet your mind with slow storytelling. This channel is not about hype, and it's not about wild speculation. It's soft science, humble science, always grounded in what we know, and honest about what we don't. If you appreciate this kind of long-form storytelling, calm, factual, and a little different from everything else out there, please take a second to like this video and subscribe. It might feel like a small gesture, but it helps this kind of content reach more people. People who, like you, are curious, and I'd love to know how you use this channel. Do you put it on before bed, while you're driving, maybe while you're working, or simply tell me what time of day you find yourself here, and from where in the world you're listening? Sharing that not only helps me, but also lets others know they're part of something bigger than themselves. Oh, and if you happen to drift off in some of the chapters, don't worry, I put timestamps in the description, so the next day you can pick the story up exactly where you left it. Because this is a story best heard from beginning to end, and as always, stay curious, stay calm. Now, tonight's story is one of the oldest we can tell, the entire history of language, when humans first talked. Tonight, we are listening for something that has never been recorded. Something no microphone, no fossil, no symbol carved on stone will ever let us recover. It is the first sound we never heard. The voice, if we can call it that, of the last common ancestor we shared with chimpanzees and bonobos, sometime around 7 million years ago. The haunting question is simple. What sounds died with the apes who almost became us? This is where the story of the language begins, long before anything we would call human existed. Around 7 million years ago in the Miocene epoch, Africa was not yet the Africa we imagine today. It was greener, more forested, and still home to a sprawling diversity of apes. From those canopies and forest edges came a lineage that would split in two. One branch would give rise to chimpanzees and bonobos, and the other would eventually produce us. But at that point, no one in this world was human. They were all apes calling to one another through sound and gesture, just as their cousins still do today. To imagine what these ancestors might have sounded like, we do not have fossils of their throats or recordings of their cries. What we have is comparative biology. Modern chimpanzees and bonobos are our closest living relatives, and by looking at their vocal repertoires, we can get a hint of what our shared ancestor may have communicated. Chimpanzees have more than 30 distinct calls. Some are food grunts, some are pant hoots that carry for long distances, some are screams of alarm or fear. Bonobos produce higher-pitched peeps and barks that in some contexts resemble infant distress, but in others are used socially, almost like chatter. Both species combine their sounds with an extraordinary range of gestures. They slap the ground, reach out their palms, or hold a posture that invites grooming. They can point in ways that signal intention, though not with the precision of human pointing. These signals are not language, but they are a system, and they are not random. The difference between a system like this and what we call language lies in structure. Animal calls are usually tied to specific emotional states or immediate needs. A food grunt is produced when a food source is discovered. An alarm call erupts when a predator is near. The signal is bound tightly to the circumstance. Language, as we understand it, allows signals to be detached from the here and now. We can tell stories about the past, imagine futures, and even invent things that do not exist. No evidence suggests our last common ancestor with chimpanzees had this ability, yet their communication was far from meaningless noise. It was functional, socially embedded, and shaped by evolutionary pressures. What kinds of pressures? One of the most important is social cohesion. Apes live in groups, and group living means navigating relationships. Calls and gestures help maintain bonds, reduce tension, and recruit allies. Chimpanzees use grooming as a social glue, but they also vocalize during grooming in ways that may strengthen trust. Bonobos, famously more tolerant, use peeps and grunts to smooth interactions. These behaviors are ancient, and they remind us that communication is not simply about transferring information. It is about managing relationships. If we imagine our ancestor 7 million years ago, we can picture a being whose world was filled with urgent needs. to eat, to avoid predators, to reproduce, to belong. Their sounds would have mapped onto those needs. Here is the reveal. Those sounds are lost forever. Unlike stone tools or ochre carvings, vocalizations do not fossilize. We cannot replay them. All we can do is triangulate between living primates and the evolutionary changes that came after. That is why studying chimpanzee and bonobo communication is so valuable. It gives us a kind of window, not into the exact calls of the past, but into the evolutionary possibilities. And the evidence suggests that our ancestor could produce a wide variety of calls, but not the combinatorial generative sentences that mark human speech. Scientists sometimes remind themselves not to underestimate animals, and that is important here. For instance, some studies show that chimpanzee alarm calls are not all identical. They can modify their screams depending on the type of predator, and other chimps respond differently depending on the scream they hear. That is proto-semantic information. The sound carries meaning about the world, not just emotion. Similarly, vervet monkeys have distinct alarm calls for snakes, eagles, and leopards. These are not our direct ancestors, but they remind us that nature has experimented with symbolic signalling many times. Our ancestor 7 million years ago may have been capable of something like this. If so, the raw ingredients for meaning-making were already present. The difficulty, of course, is separating capacity from evidence. What we know for sure is limited. Fossils tell us about bones, not sounds. Genes tell us about potential, not performance. Observations of living apes tell us about analogues, not ancestors. It is frustrating, but also humbling. Science is not in the business of certainty. It is in the business of building the most reasonable picture possible from incomplete traces. And the picture here is of an ape that lived in African forests, socially complex, vocally flexible, but not yet speaking in any sense we would recognize. If that feels underwhelming, it is worth remembering how extraordinary communication already was at this stage. Even without language, apes can negotiate alliances, recognize dozens of individuals, remember social histories, and convey urgency through cries. That is no small feat. Our ancestor 7 million years ago lived in a world where sound already carried life or death weight. A scream could save kin. A grunt could invite cooperation. A gesture could invite comfort. These were the building blocks, even if no one yet imagined poetry or myth. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a haunting question. If our ancestor called out, and no human was there to hear it, what was lost when their particular repertoire vanished? Chimpanzees and bonobos inherited part of it, we inherited other parts, and still other aspects may have disappeared entirely. Was there a sound, unique to them, that neither we nor any living ape can reproduce? A call that once filled Miocene forests, but now exists only as a ghost in evolutionary memory? As humbling as it is, the answer is that we will never know, and that, in itself, is part of the story. The history of language is not only about the words we have gained, it is about the sounds we have lost. Every branch of the tree of life carries silences as well as voices. Our species happens to be the one that turned sound into language, but that path was paved with vanished cries, forgotten calls, and communicative experiments that did not survive. We are only at the beginning of this long arc. From here, the story will carry us into lungs and tongues, into gestures and brains, into bones that almost speak. But it begins with silence, the first sound we never heard, the sound of an ancestor calling through the forest 7 million years ago, whose voice is gone, but whose echo still shapes the way we ask questions today. And the haunting question that lingers, if we could step back into that forest, would we recognize ourselves in that call, or would it be so alien that we would not even know it was meant to be understood? To think about these lost voices, we also have to remind ourselves that sound is never just about the individual making it. In forests, sound is shaped by the environment itself. A sharp bark may cut through dense foliage, while low-frequency calls carry better across long distances. Even today, chimpanzees use pant hoots that echo for kilometres, and bonobos employ high-pitched peeps that slice through background noise. Our ancestors' calls would have been tuned by similar acoustic constraints. This means that even if their voice was never like ours, their world was just as noisy with social messages, territorial claims, and constant negotiations of survival. Language did not begin in silence. It began in this layered ecology of sound. And yet, what makes the thought haunting is that we cannot know the emotional texture of those calls. Was there a proto-laughter shared during play? Was there a plaintive whimper that soothed infants? Or a rhythmic chant of sorts that emerged when groups travelled together? Emotional expression is universal in mammals, but the details are always species-specific. It is almost certain that our ancestor laughed and cried in their own way, but the quality of those sounds is unrecoverable. The first voices that mattered to our lineage are forever beyond our reach. So in the end, we begin the history of human language not with a word, not with a name, but with an absence. The first sound we never heard is a reminder of how much of our story is silence. Every language alive today rests on layers of forgotten noise, each lost branch reminding us that we did not invent communication out of nothing. We refined, we restructured, and we carried forward echoes. The story of how we first talked begins with that ghostly inheritance, the soundscape of apes who almost became us. Could gestures have been our first sentences? To ask that is to step even further back in time than the first apes that resembled us. The roots of language may stretch all the way to the early branches of primates that lived more than 30 million years ago. These were not humans, not even ancestors we would recognise as close family, but old-world monkeys scurrying through forests, balancing on branches, reaching for fruit and pulling away from predators. What could such creatures possibly have to do with the story of speech? The answer may be in their hands. When we watch a monkey reach for food or groom a companion, the movement looks simple, almost automatic. Yet modern neuroscience tells us that these actions are anything but simple. Inside the brain of a macaque or baboon, networks of neurons in the motor cortex fire in precise sequences to guide every reach and grasp. Some of these neurons are what researchers call mirror neurons, discovered in the early 1990s almost by accident. A team of Italian scientists studying macaques found that certain neurons fired not only when the monkey grasped an object itself, but also when it merely watched another monkey, or even a human, perform the same action. The brain, in other words, was simulating the movement internally just by observing it. That discovery has transformed the way many scientists think about communication. Because if a monkey can map another's action onto its own brain, as if it were doing it itself, then perhaps the first step toward language was not a sound at all, but an act of shared understanding through movement. A hand lifted, a finger pointed, a body gesture mimicked. Michael Corballis, a psychologist from New Zealand, became one of the strongest voices for this idea in the early 2000s. He suggested that before words, there were gestures, and before speech, there was a kind of pantomime performed by hominins and their primate kin. The idea is both attractive and controversial. On the attractive side, gestures are universal. Even today, children often point before they talk. Deaf communities have developed fully grammatical sign languages without any dependence on sound. When we speak, we still wave our hands, raise our eyebrows and nod our heads, as if the body cannot help but join in the work of language. Gestures are flexible, can be invented on the spot and can convey intentions without needing a fixed vocabulary. It makes sense to imagine that millions of years ago, when our distant ancestors lacked the anatomy or neural wiring for speech, they may still have communicated meaning with their bodies. But it is important to be careful. We have no fossils of gestures. Bones preserve, but movements vanish. What we do have are living primates, and their behaviour may give us glimpses of what was possible in the deep past. Chimpanzees, for instance, use more than 60 different gestures to communicate socially, from arm raises to hand clasps, each with a meaning that other chimps recognise. Bonobos are equally rich in their bodily communication, often combining gestures with vocal calls. Even rhesus macaques, which diverged from our lineage tens of millions of years ago, display gestures in social play and in conflict. These patterns suggest that the building blocks of gestural communication are ancient, far older than anything we could call language, and shared widely among primates. The question then becomes, how far back do these circuits go? Neuroanatomists suggest that the mirror neuron system, which links perception and action, evolved at least 30 to 40 million years ago, during the rise of old-world monkeys. That means the ability to understand actions by watching others, to some degree, is not an invention of apes alone, but is inherited from even earlier primate ancestors. It is tempting to imagine a group of early monkeys moving through the branches, one watching another peel fruit, and without any sound at all, understanding what was being done and perhaps even why. That shared recognition is not language, but it is a seed of what language requires, a bridge between one mind and another. If we accept this line of thought, then the path toward language did not begin with a new organ or a sudden mutation. It began with the quiet rehearsal of movements inside the brain, with one nervous system resonating to the actions of another. That is a humbling vision. It means that our ability to share words today may rest on millions of years of animals simply watching each other and making sense of what they saw. Monkey see, monkey do, and eventually, monkey understand. Still, the gesture-first hypothesis has its skeptics. Some argue that while gestures are indeed important, the transition from gesture to speech would have required too many leaps at once. How do you go from pantomime to abstract grammar? How do you preserve meaning once the lights go out and hands can no longer be seen? Others point out that vocal calls are also deeply embedded in primate behaviour, from alarm cries to mating calls, and may have been just as crucial. In this view, language may not have begun with a single channel of communication at all, but with multiple modes, voice, gesture, expression, slowly blending into a more complex system. And here lies the difficulty of writing the history of something like language. We're trying to trace not a fossilized bone or a preserved tool, but a behaviour that exists only in real time and vanishes as soon as it is performed. No trace of a pointing finger survives in the rocks. All we can do is triangulate from living primates, neurological structures, and the hints of how children develop language today. That is a fragile kind of evidence, always open to revision, and it is worth reminding ourselves that humility is the only honest stance in the face of such uncertainty. Yet, even with those limits, the gesture-first idea carries power. It offers a way to see continuity rather than rupture. Instead of imagining that language emerged suddenly with the rise of Homo sapiens, we can picture a long runway of gestural communication stretching back tens of millions of years. Every hand that reached, pointed, or mimicked was part of that slow preparation. Corballis himself framed gestures as proto-sentences, little embodied narratives that carried meaning long before sound could do the work. Think of a mother monkey pulling her infant back from danger with a sudden arm motion. Think of a male displaying with a shake of branches or a raised hand. Think of companions grooming each other, reinforcing bonds through touch and motion. These are not words, but they are structured signals combining context, intention, and reception. They show that communication can be embodied and meaningful even without speech. They remind us that perhaps our first sentences were silent ones, spoken in the theatre of movement rather than in the air of sound. And so, as we try to chart the beginnings of human language, we are left with a paradox. The story might start in silence and sight, not in voice and ear. Could gestures have been our first sentences? We cannot know for sure, but the evidence of neuroscience and primate behaviour makes it plausible. What remains haunting is that if language did begin in this way, then the very first step of our greatest invention is something we cannot record, only infer. The echoes of those ancient gestures live on in every wave of a hand, every shrug of a shoulder, every nod of recognition. In that sense, the story of speech may still carry the fingerprints of monkeys who taught each other without a single word. The silence of their movements lingers as a question. If the first language was of the hand and not the tongue, then how much of what we call human today is still carried in those unspoken sentences? Was speech seeded in the mud of ancient swamps? To answer that, we have to step back far beyond the rise of primates, beyond mammals, even beyond the age of reptiles. We must return to a time when life on land was only beginning to take shape. Around 400 million years ago, the world was covered in vast forests of primitive plants, and much of the vertebrate story still played out in water. The first four-legged creatures, the early tetrapods, were experimenting with a dangerous new frontier, the air itself. They carried with them bodies still designed for aquatic life, but they also began to evolve new tools for breathing, swallowing, and eventually vocalizing. Without their innovations, no language would ever have been possible. The starting point is simple: lungs. Fish breathe through gills, filtering oxygen dissolved in water. But for some species living in swampy or seasonal environments, water was not always reliable. Droughts could leave them stranded, pools could stagnate, and oxygen levels could plummet. Some lineages of lobe-finned fish developed a solution: an air-breathing organ, essentially a primitive lung. At first, it may have been little more than a backup system, allowing them to gulp air when water ran low. But over time, this became a permanent adaptation. By 400 million years ago, early tetrapods carried true lungs, and this transformed the mechanics of their lives. Breathing air requires drawing it into a cavity and then pushing it out again, and that rhythmic exchange would eventually become the raw material for sound. If lungs supplied the fuel, the diaphragm and chest muscles provided the pump. Modern mammals use a muscular sheet called the diaphragm to control the pressure of inhalation and exhalation, but its early precursors trace back to these ancient tetrapods. Their rib cages and musculature began to change as they adapted to life on land. Supporting the body in gravity required stronger skeletal support, and drawing air into the lungs required new muscular coordination. That same control, the ability to regulate breath in pulses, to hold and release air at will, is what makes speech possible today. Without this fine control of airflow, no creature could sustain vowels, shape consonants, or produce the steady stream of sound that human language demands. But breathing alone is not enough. Sound must be shaped, and here the tongue enters the story. In fish, the tongue is little more than a bony pad, used for shoving prey back into the throat. It is immobile, a blunt instrument. Yet as tetrapods adapted to land, the tongue became muscular, flexible, and dexterous. Amphibians like frogs and salamanders show this vividly today. They flick their tongues outward to snatch insects, manipulate prey, and swallow efficiently in air. This shift to a mobile tongue was not about speech, of course. It was about eating in a new environment. But evolution often reuses tools, and the flexible tongue would one day become an essential sculptor of sound. Consider frogs. They cannot talk, but they croak, trill, and call to one another with remarkable variety. Their vocal sacs amplify the sound, their lungs push the air, and their tongues help modulate resonance inside the mouth. Birds and mammals took these elements further, but the fundamental principle was already present. Controlled breath plus flexible vocal tract equals communication through sound. If you trace back far enough, our ability to speak poetry or tell stories under the stars is rooted in these swampy experiments with breath and tongue. The fossil record gives us only hints. Impressions of early tetrapod skeletons show expanded rib cages, evidence of lungs, and skull shapes that suggest muscular tongues. From species like Acanthostega and Ichthyostega, which lived between 365 and 375 million years ago, we see transitional anatomies caught between water and land. They still had tails for swimming, but also digits for crawling. Their gill structures were fading, replaced by airways and lungs. These creatures almost certainly made sounds, perhaps grunts or hisses of expelled air, though we cannot know exactly what they sounded like. Yet in their struggles to breathe and feed on land, they were laying the anatomical foundation for everything that would come later. It is tempting to romanticize this moment as the dawn of voice. Imagine shallow lagoons alive with amphibious creatures gasping for air, croaking at one another, their sounds echoing across fern-covered swamps. These noises were not words, but they were the first stirrings of vocal expression in vertebrates. Over time, those basic noises would diversify across lineages, becoming the bird songs of the Mesozoic, the roars of dinosaurs, the squeaks of mammals, and eventually the syllables of human speech. Still, humility is necessary. We cannot say that frogs croaking are halfway to talking, or that an early tetrapod grunt was on a direct path to language. Evolution is not linear. Many lineages explored different solutions and left no descendants that could speak. The lungfish still gulps air today, yet it has no sentences. Salamanders flick their tongues, yet they have no grammar. What matters is not that these animals were proto-speakers, but that their bodies carried innovations that would later be co-opted in unexpected ways. language is an emergent property built on ancient scaffolding. By the time reptiles and early synapsids emerged in the Carboniferous and Permian periods, control of breath and sound had advanced further. Some of these animals developed more elaborate rib musculature and greater stamina for air exchange. Fossil evidence of vocal sacs in ancient amphibians suggests that acoustic communication was already important for mating and territory. If sexual selection could drive louder and more complex calls, then the raw pressure for sound making was present long before primates ever entered the scene. The seeds of language were being planted not by brains plotting grammar, but by bodies experimenting with new ways of living in air. The diaphragm, the lungs, the tongue, these are all so mundane in our own lives that we barely notice them. Yet without their deep time history, there could be no speech at all. Every word you speak is powered by the same mechanics that allowed a Devonian tetrapod to inflate its lungs on a swampy shoreline. Every vowel rests on a tongue that once was only for swallowing. Every controlled exhalation traces back to rib muscles that once held up a struggling amphibian against gravity. The human voice is a monument built on the smallest of ancient adjustments, and here lies the haunting question. If speech depends on these ancient bodily systems, then how much of language was already determined hundreds of millions of years before humans even existed? Did the mud of ancient swamps already set the stage for poetry and philosophy? Were the first breaths of a tetrapod, taken with difficulty on land, already the ancestors of every word we breathe today? We cannot know for certain, but it reminds us that language is not only cultural, not only cognitive, it is also biological, etched into the very organs that keep us alive. To speak is to breathe, and to breathe is to inherit the long, patient work of evolution. So when we ask how humans first talked, the answer begins far earlier than we might expect. It begins in the lungs of fish gasping in shallow water. It begins in the flexible tongues of amphibians snapping at insects. It begins in the rib cages of creatures who learned to master air. The voices of humans are only the latest verse in a song that began in the Devonian swamps. And the real mystery is this: if the capacity for language is so deeply rooted in breath and body, how many other songs might have been possible in worlds where no humans ever arrived to sing them? Could Lucy have whispered? The question lingers whenever her name is spoken, because the fossilized bones of Australopithecus afarensis are some of the most famous in paleoanthropology. Found in 1974 in the Ethiopian region of Hadar, Lucy became the emblem of a species that lived more than 3 million years ago. She stood only a little over a metre tall, with long arms and a small brain, but she walked upright. She is celebrated for showing that bipedalism came before the large brain in human evolution. Yet her skeleton also invites us to wonder what she could do with her voice. The sad truth is that the fossil record cannot tell us much about soft tissues, and speech depends almost entirely on them. Vocal cords, air sacs, and the delicate muscles of the tongue do not fossilize. What we are left with are bones that can only hint at the vocal possibilities. Among the rarest of such clues is the hyoid bone, a small horseshoe-shaped structure in the throat that anchors the tongue and supports the larynx. It is essential for swallowing, but in humans it also plays a critical role in shaping speech. Without it, the tongue could not manipulate sounds with precision. In Australopithecus, one hyoid bone has been discovered, not from Lucy herself, but from a relative dated to about 3.3 million years ago. This hyoid does not resemble the human version. Instead, it is more like the hyoid of modern African apes such as chimpanzees and gorillas. In those species, the bone is shaped to support laryngeal air sacs, inflatable pouches in the throat that act as resonators. When a chimpanzee hoots or a gorilla bellows, these sacs amplify the sound and lower its frequency, making the call travel farther through the forest. They are wonderful adaptations for loud calls, but they come with a trade-off. They reduce the clarity of distinct vowels. If Australopithecus had such sacs, as the shape of the hyoid strongly suggests, then Lucy and her kin likely produced loud, resonant calls rather than the crisp, segmented syllables of speech. Their voices might have carried across the savannah, perhaps functioning in long-distance communication for safety, mating, or group coordination. But the kind of clear vowel contrasts we rely on for language, the difference between e, ah, and oo, would have been muddy, swallowed by resonance. Imagine trying to form a sentence with your throat constantly vibrating through an echo chamber. That is what Lucy's silence reminds us. The building blocks of our speech were not yet in place. Of course, this does not mean Australopithecus was mute. Far from it. Chimpanzees today have more than 30 distinct calls, ranging from pant hoots to food grunts to alarm barks. Bonobos add high-pitched peeps that even humans can mistake for infant cries. If our closest relatives are this vocal, it is hard to imagine that Lucy was any less so. She almost certainly had a repertoire of sounds, and she combined them with gestures and facial expressions to communicate in a rich, if limited, system. But could she whisper? Could she lean into a child or a companion and form a soft, precise signal that depended on vowel clarity? The evidence says no. Her voice was too resonant, too generalized, too tied to the booming displays of the forest and savanna. There is also the question of breathing control. The rib cage of Australopithecus suggests a conical chest, more similar to apes than to modern humans. Such a chest shape allows for powerful bursts of air, but not the fine-tuned, extended exhalation necessary for long strings of syllables. This further hints that Lucy's vocalizations were bursts, not flowing streams of sound. She could call, bark, grunt, and perhaps laugh, but she could not sustain the breath needed for extended sequences of words. Yet it would be unfair to see this as a deficiency. Communication is not only about sound. Australopithecus would have lived in small groups, where visual contact was common and gestures carried enormous weight. Grooming, hand signals, body posture, and facial expression would have conveyed just as much as vocal calls. Some researchers argue that in such contexts, gesture may even have dominated over sound. If so, then Lucy's silence is less an absence than a reminder that the pathway to language may have begun with hands, not with voices. What is humbling is how much we do not know. Did Australopithecus mothers soothe their infants with repetitive coos, as chimpanzee mothers do today? Did males inflate their throat sacs to boom across the valley, intimidating rivals? Did individuals combine sounds in any proto-syntactic way, stringing them into sequences that carried more meaning than a single call? The fossils cannot answer. They can only whisper back through time that our vocal capacity was still limited, still resonant, still waiting for changes that would strip away the sacs and open the throat to clarity. And that raises a haunting thought. Air sacs are common across primates, but humans lost them. We sacrificed volume for precision. Somewhere after Lucy's time, our lineage gave up the booming echoes of the forest for the crisp distinctions of vowels and consonants. That trade-off set us on the path to language, but it also left us quieter, more vulnerable, more dependent on proximity to be heard. In Lucy's silence, we glimpse a fork in the evolutionary road. One branch continued to roar, the other would one day whisper poetry. So when we imagine Lucy standing upright on the Ethiopian plains, we should not picture her chatting around a fire. Her silence was not absolute, but it was a silence of limitation. She could call, but not converse. She could cry out, but not explain. She could gesture, but not describe. Her voice was the voice of an ape experimenting with upright life, not yet the voice of a storyteller. The larger mystery is whether she cared. To us, the inability to whisper feels like a profound absence. To her, it may not have mattered. She lived in a world where communication was adequate for survival, where meaning was carried by sound, sight, and touch, in a balance we may never fully understand. Her silence is haunting only because we measure it against what we became. For her, it was enough. And so Lucy's bones remind us not only of what was missing, but of how long the road to speech really was. 3 million years ago, the human voice had not yet been born. It was still resonant, booming, echoing through air sacs and shallow breaths. The story of language was still waiting, and the first whispers were still millions of years away. The question lingers, could Lucy have whispered? The most honest answer is no, and yet her silence speaks volumes. Did walking upright free more than our hands? It is easy to take bipedalism for granted, to picture early humans simply standing tall and striding across the savannah, but the change was not only about locomotion. When our ancestors moved from the crouched gait of apes to the balanced rhythm of two-legged walking, something subtle but profound also shifted in the relationship between the body and communication. Hands that once gripped branches were suddenly freed for carrying, for shaping, for pointing. And yet, in this period, 2 to 1.5 million years ago, the tongue and the voice box were still waiting for their moment. The paradox of Homo habilis and early Homo erectus is that their bodies looked ready for language in some respects, but their throats were not. Archaeology first gave us Homo habilis, discovered in the early 1960s in Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania. The name means handy man, and it was chosen because of the association with stone tools. These were not the crude flakes made by Australopithecines, but more deliberate shapes, the old Doan tradition of chipped cores and sharp-edged flakes used for cutting meat or cracking bones. Toolmaking of this kind requires forethought, the ability to imagine the end result and remove stone systematically to achieve it. This cognitive leap suggests communication of some kind, for skills like this are difficult to learn by observation alone. One can picture habilis showing rather than telling, using gestures, demonstrating the strike angle, the twist of the wrist. Mime may have been the first classroom. By the time Homo erectus appeared around 1.9 million years ago, the technological world had grown even more complex. Erectus made Acheulean hand axes, teardrop-shaped tools symmetrical on both sides, carefully thinned and capable of cutting, chopping and scraping. These tools are found across Africa, Asia and Europe, showing a cultural continuity that endured for more than 1 million years. The persistence of such standardized shapes hints at a tradition of teaching and learning, perhaps involving gestural instruction, demonstrations repeated across generations. Words were still out of reach, but culture was already present. Bipedalism itself may have helped in ways that go beyond freeing the hands. When the spine curves to balance the body upright, the position of the larynx and the musculature of breathing also shift. The rib cage of early Homo shows a flatter shape than Australopithecines, a sign of improved control of breath. Breath control is essential for speech, though here it would still have been limited. Fossil evidence such as the famous Turkana boy skeleton, dated to around 1.6 million years ago in Kenya, reveals a spinal cord imprint within the vertebrae that has been debated for decades. The cavity appears narrower than in modern humans, suggesting fewer nerve fibres supplying the muscles of the diaphragm and intercostals. If correct, this would mean that erectus lacked the fine motor control needed for long, sustained exhalations. Speech requires breath to be released slowly and with precision, but erectus may have been limited to shorter bursts of sound, more like loud calls than flowing sentences. Still, those short bursts could have mattered. The question is whether erectus supplemented gestures with calls that carried specific meanings. Some scholars argue that the communicative system was multimodal, pointing, miming and vocal bursts all mixed together. Imagine an early hunter standing over a carcass, pointing to one flank of the animal, gesturing a cut with the hand, and vocalizing a sharp bark to reinforce urgency. In such contexts, words are not necessary. Shared attention and shared action are enough. And that may be the real innovation of upright posture. Freed from the need to grip branches, the hands became tools of representation. Pointing, beckoning, miming actions, and shaping symbols in the air would have allowed groups to share information about absent objects or future plans. Gestural communication has been observed in chimpanzees, who use dozens of hand signals in the wild. But with Homo habilis and erectus, these gestures would have been accompanied by a growing capacity for cooperative action. Hunting larger game, carrying food, defending against predators, all required coordination on a scale greater than what Australopithecines faced. Language had not yet arrived, but the stage was being prepared. The Acheulean hand axe itself can be read as a message. Its symmetry, repeated so faithfully across continents, suggests that early humans shared mental templates. These were not random rocks chipped opportunistically, but carefully planned designs, and they persisted for hundreds of thousands of years. Some archaeologists even call them the first cultural memes, patterns passed on not by genes but by social learning. To maintain such precision over such timescales requires more than trial and error. It implies some form of instruction, likely based on gesture, demonstration, and perhaps simple vocal calls. Another clue comes from the organisation of campsites. Archaeological sites attributed to Homo erectus show evidence of hearths, concentrations of stone tools, and spatial patterns suggesting that activities were separated into zones. Though we must be cautious, such arrangements imply a degree of social planning. To maintain cooperation within groups of perhaps 20 or more individuals, communication systems had to evolve beyond the limited repertoires of apes. A combination of mime and vocalization may have filled that gap, and yet, when we imagine these early humans, we must resist the temptation to project fluent speech back onto them. Their throats were not ready. The shape of their hyoid, as far as we know from rare fossils, still resembled that of apes. Air sacs may have still been present, muddying vowel distinctions. Their neural control over breathing may have been insufficient for long sentences. They lived in a twilight zone between gesture and voice, where hands carried most of the burden and the tongue waited for its future role. This makes their silence even more fascinating, because silence is not the absence of communication. It is the limit of a system at a particular time. The grunts and shouts of Erectus were probably effective, but they were not words. Their gestures were likely rich, but they were not yet grammar. What they achieved, however, was remarkable. A culture of tools, a spread across continents, an endurance lasting more than 1 million years. They did all this with half-born language, with hands freed and tongues waiting. So did walking upright free more than our hands. It freed our minds to coordinate in new ways, it freed our communities to teach through demonstration, and it freed our ancestors to carry culture across time and space. But it did not yet free the voice. The tongue was waiting, the breath was waiting, the larynx was waiting. The story of language remained incomplete, and that leaves us with the haunting question. When Homo erectus stood by a fire in the African night, gesturing to companions about the hunt, did they feel the pressure of something missing? Did they sense that their voices were inadequate, that their hands had to do the talking? Or were they content, never imagining the flood of words that would one day follow? We cannot know. What we do know is that the balance between body and voice was still shifting, and that shift would eventually tip. But for more than 1 million years, humanity's ancestors lived in a world where hands spoke louder than tongues. What did the pit of bones echo with? In the hills of northern Spain, deep beneath the Sierra de Atapuerca, lies a chamber that has haunted anthropology for decades. It is called Cima de los Huesos, the pit of bones, and inside that narrow shaft more than 24 skeletons of ancient humans were found, jumbled together in a darkness they have occupied for almost 500,000 years. This site, dated to around 450,000 years ago, is not just a grave. It is a window into a moment when human voices may have been far closer to ours than to those of apes. The remains belong to Homo heidelbergensis, a species often described as a midpoint between earlier Homo erectus and later Neanderthals. The bones tell us much about their strength, their robust skulls, their heavy brows, but they also whisper something subtler. Among the collection was a fossilized hyoid bone, that delicate horseshoe-shaped structure in the throat that anchors the tongue and supports speech. For years, the hyoid was a frustrating absence in the fossil record, rarely preserved because of its fragility. To find one in the pit of bones was almost miraculous. Its shape was not identical to modern humans, but it leaned closer to us than to any ape. The importance of this cannot be overstated. In apes, the hyoid supports a vocal tract designed for powerful calls, but limited vowel variety. In humans, the hyoid sits lower, allowing a longer pharyngeal cavity and the range of vowels that make up speech. The specimen from Atapuerca suggested that by this time, humans had already evolved a throat capable of producing more distinct sounds. The pit of bones did not give us a voice recording, but it gave us an anatomical hint that language, or something approaching it, might have been within reach. Even more striking was the discovery of a child's skull so well preserved that researchers could reconstruct parts of the vocal tract digitally. Using imaging and modelling, scientists estimated the shape and size of the cavities involved in speech. The conclusion was cautious but profound. This child could have produced at least some distinct vowels. Not the full fluidity of modern speech, perhaps, but more than mere grunts. The capacity for a rudimentary proto-language, articulated with clarity, was now a real possibility. And yet, as always in this story, caution is required. Anatomy does not prove behaviour. A throat capable of speech does not guarantee speech was used. But the context of the pit of bones invites speculation of a careful kind. To place so many bodies together in one chamber may suggest a kind of deliberate action, though whether it was burial, disposal, or accident remains debated. Whatever the explanation, the act involved a group, and groups require communication. Coordinating such a collective event may have needed more than gestures and calls. It is worth remembering that Homo heidelbergensis was not a small-brained creature fumbling in silence. Their cranial capacity overlapped with ours, often exceeding 1,000 cubic centimeters. They hunted large game, they controlled fire, and they lived in complex social groups. If the vocal tract was capable of richer sound, the mind behind it may have been capable of richer intention. Even if their language lacked the abstraction of ours, it may have been functional, nuanced, and deeply embedded in their survival. The echoes of that pit remind us of how fragmentary our knowledge is. The hyoid bone is fragile, the vocal tract is soft tissue that rarely fossilizes, and the reconstructions depend on models that carry assumptions. Scientists debate whether the Atapuerca hyoid truly signals modern-like speech, or merely an intermediate form. Some argue that other factors, such as neural control over breathing and the fine motor control of the tongue, were equally important, and those cannot be read from bones alone. But even if the case is not closed, the pit of bones gave us one of the strongest hints yet that language's door was opening long before our own species arrived. Think of the soundscape of that time. Imagine a valley where groups of Homo heidelbergensis hunted together, where warnings of predators were called out, where children cried and were soothed, where alliances were maintained with vocal reassurance. The gestures of earlier humans had not disappeared, but now the voice could have begun to take on more weight. Perhaps distinct vowel sounds allowed names, places, or commands to be voiced with new clarity. The leap from gesture to word is not a simple step, but the anatomy of these humans suggests it was at least anatomically possible. What makes this moment even more haunting is its position in time. 450,000 years ago is long before Homo sapiens, long before symbolic carvings or painted caves. The pit of bones whispers from a deep past, where language was not yet history, but becoming. It was a threshold world, where the machinery of speech was aligning even if the grammar of speech was still unborn. And so we ask again, what did the pit of bones echo with? Was it filled with the silence of bodies dropped one by one, or did it resound with words spoken in mourning? Did companions call out names as they placed their dead, or did they simply grunt, gesture, and move on? We cannot know, but the very possibility that their throats could have carried words makes the silence more poignant. To study this site is to stand at the edge of a cliff and look into fog. The shapes are tantalizing, but they are not clear. We have bone, we have reconstructions, we have hypotheses. What we do not have is certainty. And that, in its own way, is what makes the pit of bones so powerful. It is not just a grave of ancient humans, it is a grave of lost voices. As humble scientists, we must admit that we cannot resurrect those voices, but we can trace the contours of their possibility. We can say that by 450,000 years ago, the architecture of speech was emerging. We can say that these humans were closer to language than any before them. And we can say that whatever words may have been uttered, they are gone, absorbed into the rock and soil. The haunting question lingers. If the pit of bones could speak back, what stories would it tell us? Would it recount the origins of language, or would it laugh at our eagerness to hear ourselves in its silence? Perhaps the greatest echo from that chamber is the reminder that the history of language is not just about the rise of words, but about the voices that never reached us. Is one gene the reason you can listen to this sentence? The story of language is often told in terms of bones, throats, brains, and breath. But hidden beneath all those structures is a script of its own, the genome. Among the thousands of genes that make us who we are, one in particular has become famous for its suspected role in speech. It is called FOXP2, and though it is just a strand of molecular instructions, its influence reaches the air you exhale as words. The FOXP2 gene is not a recent invention of our species. It is ancient, present in mammals, birds, even reptiles. Its job, as far as we understand it, is to regulate the growth and function of neural circuits that control complex movements. For a bird, this might mean the learning of song. For a human, it may mean the fine coordination of the tongue, lips, and larynx. FOXP2 does not carry instructions for words themselves. Instead, It shapes the neurological foundation that makes words possible. In that sense, it is not a language gene, but a gene whose changes may have opened doors for language to evolve. The story became dramatic in the late 20th century, when scientists studied a British family, known in research papers as the 𝐓𝐻𝐒 family, where many members had a striking disorder. They struggled to articulate words clearly, had difficulty with grammar, and could not sequence sounds into fluent speech. Their intelligence was otherwise normal, but their ability to produce and process language was impaired. Genetic analysis revealed that all affected members shared a mutation in FOXP2. This finding catapulted the gene into fame. Here, it seemed, was a molecular switch for speech. As often happens in science, the reality turned out to be more nuanced. FOXP2 does not control only speech. The gene is expressed in regions of the brain like the basal ganglia and cerebellum, areas involved in motor control and sequencing. In mice, altering FOXP2 changes the way pups squeak. In songbirds, it disrupts their ability to learn and reproduce songs. The picture that emerges is of a gene that helps tune the neural circuits underlying vocal learning, not one that magically generates language. The evolutionary twist comes when we look back in time. Comparing human FOXP2 to that of chimpanzees, researchers discovered that our version carries 2 amino acid substitutions that arose after our lineages split. Genetic studies suggest these changes occurred sometime between 500,000 and 200,000 years ago. That window is crucial. It places the mutations in the era when archaic humans like 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿 were alive, and when both Neanderthals and our own species were beginning to take shape. The implications are extraordinary. These changes to FOXP2 may have fine-tuned neural circuits for the control of speech muscles, giving our ancestors greater precision in producing sequences of sounds. The timing aligns with other evidence we have seen. The appearance of hyoid bones closer to ours, larger brains with refined motor cortices, and perhaps a growing reliance on more complex vocal communication. While no single gene ever explains a trait as vast as language, FOXP2 offers a rare genetic clue, a point where biology and speech touch. When scientists sequenced Neanderthal DNA, the story grew even more interesting. They found that Neanderthals carried the same amino acid changes in FOXP2 as modern humans. This suggests the mutations predate the split between our lineages, occurring in a common ancestor at least several 100,000 years ago. The idea that Neanderthals shared this genetic capacity implies they too may have had advanced vocal abilities. However, later studies suggested the regulation of the gene, how much and where it was expressed in the brain, might have differed between us and them. The blueprint was the same, but the way it was read could have varied. This uncertainty reveals both the promise and the limits of genetic archaeology. A gene sequence tells us what is possible, not what was done. FOXP2's role is broad, affecting not just the voice but also motor learning more generally. Even in humans today, mutations in the gene can cause speech deficits, but they also affect cognition, motor planning, and learning. So while it is tempting to call FOXP2 the language gene, it is better understood as part of a larger orchestra. It may be one of the conductors, but the music requires many players. What is most humbling is that we do not yet understand why those 2 amino acid substitutions mattered so much. They changed the protein slightly, but how exactly that reshaped neural circuitry is still under study. Experiments in mice engineered to carry the human version of FOXP2 suggest altered dopamine activity in the brain and differences in the plasticity of motor circuits. These mice also squeak differently, hinting at changes in vocalization. In songbirds, manipulating FOXP2 levels during learning disrupts their ability to copy songs. These findings make it plausible that in humans, the altered gene enhanced the ability to learn and coordinate vocal sequences, a foundation for speech. But language is not just sound. It is also syntax, semantics, pragmatics. FOXP2 cannot explain those. What it might explain is why humans, unlike chimpanzees, can string dozens of precise, rapid movements of the tongue and lips together in a matter of seconds. It could be the difference between a grunt and a sentence. If so, then FOXP2 was not the language gene, but perhaps the fluency gene, the one that allowed speech to flow rather than stumble. The timeline raises haunting questions. If Homo heidelbergensis carried the modern FOXP2, did they already have something like speech? If Neanderthals had it, did they speak as well? And if they did, what did they say, and why was their story cut short while ours continued? These questions linger, because genes cannot tell us what words were spoken, only that the machinery was there to speak them. It is also important to recognise that FOXP2 is not unique to us. Birds, mice, bats, even fish rely on it for various motor and communication functions. In that sense, the gene reminds us that the roots of speech stretch far deeper than humanity. Evolution did not invent language in a single stroke. It tinkered with existing machinery, nudging circuits toward new uses. The FOXP2 mutations were one such nudge, a molecular step that may have tilted the balance toward fluent speech. And here we find ourselves, speaking and listening across centuries, because of a tiny change in a protein chain hundreds of thousands of years ago. It is humbling to think that two small mutations could ripple into poetry, politics, lullabies, and this very sentence. Yet the silence remains. FOXP2 cannot tell us the content of early conversations, or whether they carried humour, myth, or ritual. All it can tell us is that the possibility of fluent speech was present. So is one gene the reason you can listen to this sentence? The honest answer is no, not by itself. Language is too vast, too layered, too dependent on culture and brain and breath to be reduced to a single gene. But FOXP2 is part of the reason. It is a reminder that our words are built on ancient molecular scaffolds, and that the history of language is also the history of molecules. The haunting question is whether, if we could hear those first humans with modern FOXP2 speak, we would recognise their voices as kin. Would we hear clear words, or something just shy of language? Would we lean in, straining to catch the meaning, realising that the sentence was almost there, but not quite? Perhaps the most striking legacy of FOXP2 is not what it gave us, but what it suggests was already possible long before us. The gene whispers that language was waiting, not inevitable, but within reach, carried silently in the code of our cells. Could you have heard a Neanderthal's joke? That is the question that sits quietly behind the bones of ancient skulls and the delicate fossils of inner ears. Speech is not only about producing sound, it is also about receiving it. Words mean nothing if they vanish into the air unheard. For language to evolve, ears had to evolve with it. In the long history of communication, hearing was not just the passive half of the equation, it was an active shaper of what could be said at all. When we speak of ears, we usually think of the outer shape, the fleshy folds that guide sound into the head. But much of what matters is hidden inside. The canal that funnels vibrations, the drum that turns them into mechanical motion, and the tiny ossicles, the malleus, incus, and stapes, that carry those vibrations into the fluid-filled spiral of the cochlea. In mammals, this structure is finely tuned, capable of picking up a wide range of frequencies, but the range differs from species to species, and those differences determine what calls can be understood and which fall into silence. Fossil evidence suggests that the evolutionary refinement of hearing was not uniform across hominins. Beginning around 3 million years ago, species like Australopithecus show ear canals and ossicles not unlike those of chimpanzees, optimized for picking up lower frequencies. This makes sense, because chimpanzee calls tend to rely on vowels, broad resonant sounds that carry far in the forest. The lower frequency range helps them recognize pant hoots or alarm calls. But as our lineage moved toward more complex vocal repertoires, something shifted. The middle ear bones of later hominins, including Homo heidelbergensis and Neanderthals, revealed changes in proportions that sharpened sensitivity to slightly higher frequencies. Not just the booming vowels, but also the sharper bursts of sound that would one day become consonants. When researchers modelled how Neanderthals heard, they discovered that their optimal hearing range overlapped almost exactly with that of modern humans, especially in the band between 2 and 4 kHz, the sweet spot where many speech sounds fall. This suggests that their auditory systems were not just capable of hearing the environment, but were already tuned for the kinds of rapid, precise sounds necessary for spoken language. It is tempting to imagine a Neanderthal laughing, their voice carrying the subtle shifts in pitch and tone that we use to signal humour. If their ears could hear those nuances, then their social worlds might have been filled with more than just calls. They might have shared gossip, warnings, or stories. We cannot know the content, but the hardware was there. The evolution of hearing also tells us about the pressures of environment. Australopithecines lived in mixed habitats, from forests to open savannas. Their hearing range was biased toward lower frequencies, which carry further in dense vegetation. Later hominins, living in more open landscapes, seem to have shifted toward higher frequency sensitivity. Shorter wavelength sounds travel less far but carry more information. This trade-off may have mirrored the growing importance of close-range social interaction. As groups became larger and coordination more demanding, the need to hear precise sounds at close range outweighed the need to hear vague calls at a distance. In that sense, the ear bones whisper to us about the changing social fabric of early humans. One remarkable discovery came from the site of Cima de los Huesos in Spain, a cave that preserved the remains of Homo heidelbergensis about 450,000 years ago. Their ossicles, when reconstructed, show auditory patterns already shifted toward the modern range. It seems that by this time, our ancestors were not only making sounds with greater control, but also hearing them with greater clarity. The two systems evolved in tandem, vocal tracts shaping sound, ears shaping perception. This co-evolution is critical. If an ancestor had developed the ability to produce new sounds, but the ears of their companions could not detect them, the innovation would vanish. Evolutionary change only persists if it fits into a system. Speech is a system, and hearing was half of it. In the fossil record, we see that gradual tuning, from broad low-frequency sensitivity toward the crisp middle frequencies where consonants reside. Why consonants? Because vowels alone can carry only so much. They fill the air with resonance but do not easily encode precise differences. Consonants, the sharp closures and bursts of air, allow thousands of possible distinctions, but they are also quieter, shorter, easier to miss. Without ears tuned to hear them, consonants are useless. The fact that Neanderthals and Homo heidelbergensis had ears tuned to this range suggests that by their time, the world of communication had expanded beyond simple vowel-like calls. Still, we must be cautious. Hearing is not proof of language. Dolphins hear high frequencies, yet they do not speak in sentences. What hearing tells us is potential. The potential to recognize rapid transitions of sound, to follow the rhythm of syllables, to distinguish words in a noisy group. Combined with the anatomical evidence for vocal tracts and breath control, the ear evidence strengthens the case that ancient humans were already close to something we would recognize as speech. The humility of this research lies in the fact that much of it depends on tiny fossils, bones the size of grains of rice. The malleus, incus, and stapes are among the smallest bones in the body, and yet they carry clues about entire soundscapes. When paleontologists measure their dimensions and plug them into acoustic models, they are trying to resurrect the hearing worlds of beings who have been silent for hundreds of thousands of years. There is a poetry in that, trying to hear through bones. Some researchers have even speculated that the refinement of hearing for speech may have helped drive social complexity. If you can hear subtle distinctions, you can recognize individuals by voice. You can detect emotion in tone. You can coordinate with precision. The ear, in this view, was not just a passive organ, but an engine of social evolution. The ability to hear better may have fostered tighter group cohesion, more effective teaching, and perhaps even the first glimmers of shared humour. Could you have heard a Neanderthal's joke? If by joke we mean a play of sounds, a twist in tone, perhaps the answer is yes. Their ears were ready for it. Whether their minds were tuned to the same subtleties of irony or wit we cannot say. But the possibility is there, waiting in the silence of their skulls. The broader implication is that speech was not an invention of a single species, but a gradual weaving of many threads, lungs, throats, brains, and ears all changing together. Ears that learned to listen made mouths that could be worth listening to. Each adaptation reinforced the others until the system tipped from animal calls into something richer. The haunting question is not whether Neanderthals could hear as we do, but what they did with that hearing. Did they listen to songs in the wind, to stories told at firelight, to children babbling at the edge of language? We may never know, but their ear bones suggest that if you stood beside them and spoke slowly and clearly, they would have understood. Perhaps not every word, but enough to smile, enough to reply, enough to share the most human act of all, conversation. Did Neanderthals argue, sing, or just grunt? That question has followed us for more than a century, shaping how we imagine our closest evolutionary relatives. The sound of Neanderthal life is gone, erased with their extinction around 40,000 years ago, but the bones they left behind allow us to make cautious guesses. Language leaves no fossils, but the machinery of voice does. In a cave on Mount Carmel in Israel, a single bone has fueled this debate for decades. It is the hyoid of a Neanderthal who lived about 60,000 years ago, and it has become one of the most controversial pieces of evidence in the history of human evolution. The hyoid is a small horseshoe-shaped bone that floats in the throat, anchoring muscles of the tongue and larynx. In humans, its position and shape allow for the precise modulation of vocal sounds. In chimpanzees and most other primates, the hyoid is shaped differently, supporting air sacs that make their calls resonate, but limiting fine control over vowels and consonants. The Neanderthal hyoid from Kabara Cave, when first examined, looked strikingly modern. This suggested that Neanderthals had the same capacity for speech as we do. But for years, many scientists hesitated. A single bone seemed too fragile a foundation for such a claim. It was only with advances in imaging that the debate deepened. Computerized tomography scans allowed researchers to model not just the shape of the bone, but how it fit with surrounding musculature. By simulating the biomechanics, they showed that the Kabara hyoid behaved like a modern human hyoid. It supported a larynx capable of nuanced control, producing a wide range of vowels and consonants. In other words, if the rest of the vocal tract matched, the bone would not have been a limiting factor. This finding overturned an older stereotype of Neanderthals as grunting brutes, capable only of simple sounds. The evidence instead pointed to near-modern vocal capacity. The difference between their voices and ours, if any, would not have been in the raw mechanics of sound production, but in how those sounds were used and organised. The question shifts then from could they talk to what did they say? Skepticism remains. Language is not just anatomy. It also requires cognition, memory, and shared symbols. The fact that Neanderthals had the physical ability to produce speech does not prove they strung sounds into syntax. This is why the debate often expands into arguments about symbolic culture. Did Neanderthals use language to tell stories, to teach, to gossip? Or was their communication limited to the concrete, the location of prey, the call to gather, the warning of danger? The absence of clear symbolic artifacts leaves the door open to both interpretations. But perhaps the focus on symbols risks missing the point. Imagine standing near a group of Neanderthals. Even if their speech lacked the recursive complexity of modern grammar, even if their vocabularies were smaller, the voices would still have carried nuance. They could have argued, comforted a child, coordinated a hunt, or mourned a death. Tone, rhythm, and emphasis alone carry enormous meaning. To reduce them to grunts does not do justice to what the fossil evidence suggests. The reconstruction of Neanderthal vocal tracts goes beyond the hyoid. Skulls and teeth reveal palate shapes, nasal cavities, and oral spaces. Together, these indicate that Neanderthals could produce distinct vowel sounds, though perhaps with slightly different ranges than ours. Some researchers argue that their shorter vocal tracts may have constrained the extremes of high front vowels like E, or low back vowels like O, but this is debated. What seems consistent is that their range was sufficient for intelligible speech-like communication. Hearing studies complement this view. As discussed earlier, the auditory systems of Neanderthals were tuned to the same frequency ranges as ours, optimized for the rapid changes of consonant-rich speech. This mutual adaptation, the ability to produce and perceive, makes it unlikely that their communication relied only on crude vocalizations. Evolution rarely maintains unused potential. If their ears were listening for speech-like sounds, and their throats could produce them, then it is reasonable to think those sounds mattered in their daily lives. Still, there is humility in this reconstruction. Every model rests on assumptions, and each fossil represents just one individual. Could the Kabara Neanderthal's hyoid have been unusual? Could there have been variation in vocal capacity among different groups? We cannot be sure. But taken together, the hyoid, the vocal tract reconstructions, the auditory capacities, the weight of evidence leans toward voices that were far closer to ours than once imagined. If so, What did those voices sound like? Their anatomy suggests deeper chests and broader throats, which may have given their speech a different timbre. Some anthropologists speculate that Neanderthal voices could have been lower pitched on average, resonant in a way that modern humans would find commanding or even intimidating. But again, this is speculation. The truth may be that their voices were as varied as ours, from soft and high to booming and deep. The haunting question remains: did they sing? Music leaves almost no trace in the archaeological record, yet song could have been a natural extension of speech. A mother soothing a child with melody, a group chanting to coordinate, hunters using rhythm to keep pace. None of these require symbolic art, only a capacity for controlled voice and a sense of rhythm. The potential was there, even if the proof is not. Some resist the idea of Neanderthal speech because it feels like it blurs the boundary between them and us. If they spoke, then why did they not survive? But this way of framing the question is misleading. Survival depends on many factors: population size, climate, chance encounters, not only on communication. To imagine that language is the sole marker of success is to overestimate our own uniqueness. The Neanderthals may have spoken and still vanished, just as countless other capable species have. The story of the 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐏𝐒𝐌𝐏𝐻 is a reminder of how small things can reshape grand narratives. A single bone, overlooked for decades, has forced us to reconsider the soundscape of the past. When we picture Neanderthals now, it is harder to imagine them mutely grunting in caves. Instead, we might imagine them talking at firelight, voices rising and falling in arguments, laughter or song. The evidence is not proof, but it bends the imagination toward humanity rather than caricature. So, did Neanderthals argue, sing, or just grunt? The evidence says they could have done all three. They had the vocal machinery, the hearing, and likely the social needs that make speech useful. What they lacked, perhaps, is the density of population, and the cultural momentum that pushes language into complexity. Their voices may have carried fewer words, simpler structures, shorter sentences. But within those constraints, a Neanderthal could still have said, "Come here, danger there," or "I am cold." And those sentences, stripped of poetry, are still unmistakably human. The haunting question is not whether Neanderthals had voices, but whether we would have understood them. If one stood before you and spoke, would the sounds fall into place as words, or would they slide off your ears as strange and almost familiar noise? Perhaps both. Their language may have been close enough to grasp, yet distant enough to unsettle. A reminder that in the cave echoes of 60,000 years ago, voices once rose that were not ours, but not entirely different either. Did DNA give us a timestamp for the first words? It is tempting to think of genomes as clock faces, quietly ticking through the ages, waiting for us to learn how to read them. Unlike bones or tools, DNA does not fossilize in stone layers, but fragments survive in teeth, in dense bones, in permafrost. Even where the strands themselves crumble away, the patterns they leave in living populations allow scientists to rewind history. By comparing mutations, by aligning the molecular drift of generations, researchers have begun to sketch the timeline of when our ancestors may have acquired the ability to speak as we do. One of the most ambitious efforts came from a meta-analysis led at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where researchers attempted to align genetic evidence with linguistic capacity. Their conclusion, while tentative, was striking. The genomic record suggested that the biological underpinnings of language were in place by roughly 135,000 years ago. That does not mean that full modern languages exploded at that date. Instead, it means the machinery, the neurological and anatomical readiness had emerged. Widespread use, the flourishing of language in daily life, seemed to take hold closer to 100,000 years ago. In evolutionary terms, that is almost yesterday. The method behind these conclusions was not simple. Genes do not announce themselves with labels saying this one controls syntax or this one allows vowel shifts. Most genes have multiple roles, and language emerges from the interaction of many systems: motor control, hearing, memory, sociality. Scientists approach the problem indirectly, looking at lineages of genes involved in brain growth, synapse formation, and vocal control. One of the most famous markers, FOXP2, had already drawn attention for its link to speech disorders. But FOXP2 was just one piece of a larger network, a gear in a much more complicated machine. The meta-analysis pulled together dozens of studies, each tracing mutations through ancient and modern genomes, searching for signals of selection that might hint at a shift toward language readiness. The result was a convergence on a window in the late Middle Pleistocene, a period when our species was taking shape in Africa. Around 135,000 years ago, the genetic landscape begins to look recognisably modern in ways that matter for language. Neural plasticity, auditory tuning, and motor precision all show signs of refinement. By 100,000 years ago, those refinements appear widespread across populations. The implication is that if you could travel back to that time, you might find groups of Homo sapiens not just gesturing and calling, but speaking in structured forms. It is important, though, to be cautious. Genomic clocks are not precise wristwatches. They are more like sundials on cloudy days. The rate of mutation is not perfectly steady. Population bottlenecks, migrations, and chance events distort the signal. What emerges is not an exact year, but a window of possibility. Within that window, culture and environment determine whether the biological capacity blossoms into everyday use. Language may have flickered earlier, in smaller groups, only to spread widely once conditions stabilized. The haunting part of this reconstruction is the silence that surrounds it. We can say that the genes were in place, but not what the first words were, or what they meant. Did they mark kinship, directions, pleas for help, or were they names for plants and animals, tags for things in the environment? The genomic clock can only tell us when the machinery was ready, not what the voices said. It is like finding the blueprint for a musical instrument without ever hearing the melody it played. Still, the genetic evidence provides a counterweight to skepticism. For much of the 20th century, some researchers argued that language might have been a very late invention, perhaps even only 10 or 20,000 years ago. The genomic data makes that unlikely. The biological readiness was too old, too widespread. Language was not a sudden spark, but a capacity waiting to be used, refined, and expanded. The stories we tell about its late arrival need to be adjusted to fit what DNA suggests. One way scientists tested these ideas was by comparing our genomes with those of Neanderthals and Denisovans. These archaic relatives shared many of the same variants associated with language. The FOXP2 gene, for instance, appears in a similar form in Neanderthals, suggesting they too had motor control sufficient for speech. Other genes involved in auditory processing show overlap, but there are differences as well, particularly in regulatory regions, the parts of DNA that control when and how much a gene is expressed. These subtle shifts may have influenced the rhythm and fluency of speech, even if the raw capacity was shared. What the MIT group highlighted is that by 135,000 years ago, our own lineage had crossed a threshold into full readiness. The idea of a genomic clock for language changes how we think about prehistory. Instead of waiting for symbolic artifacts to appear, we can imagine language already woven into daily life long before the caves of Europe filled with paintings. Around African campfires, 100,000 years ago, words may have been passed from parent to child, shaping memory, teaching, gossiping. The fact that no symbols survive from that time does not mean the voices were silent. It only means that speech leaves no durable trace in stone. There is another layer to the story. The spread of language across populations may have been tied to demographic expansion. As groups grew larger, the pressure to coordinate and maintain social cohesion increased. Language could have been the bridge that allowed larger communities to function without splintering. The genomic evidence of readiness aligns with archaeological hints of more complex group behaviours at similar timescales. While we cannot link one directly to the other, the pattern suggests that once the capacity was present, cultural forces amplified it. Even so, there are limits to what can be claimed. Every attempt to connect a gene to language risks oversimplification. The genome is not a script that says, here, language begins. It is a set of potentials shaped by environment and history. The MIT meta-analysis itself emphasizes uncertainty, presenting its findings as probabilities rather than certainties. Language may have been possible earlier, but by 135,000 years ago, it was no longer just possible. It was likely. That shift from possibility to likelihood is what the genomic clock tries to capture. One way to imagine it is to think of evolution as tuning an instrument. For millions of years, the strings were being stretched, adjusted, prepared. Around 135,000 years ago, the tuning was close enough that the first notes could be played. By 100,000 years ago, entire melodies were possible. What those melodies were, we will never know. But the fact that we can trace the preparation reminds us that language did not come from nowhere. It was seeded deep in our biology, cultivated over vast spans of time, and finally brought into use when the environment allowed. And yet the haunting question lingers. If genomes can tell us when the machinery for language was ready, why can they not tell us what those first voices said? Perhaps that is the boundary between biology and culture. DNA can shape the stage, but the play itself is written by lives lived, by stories told, by meanings shared. The genomic clock gives us the curtain time, but not the script. To know that script, we must rely on imagination, tempered by humility, always remembering that what we reconstruct is not proof, but possibility. So did DNA give us a timestamp for the first words? In a way, yes. It points to a time in the late Middle Pleistocene when our ancestors were already equipped to speak. By 100,000 years ago, they were likely using that capacity widely. Beyond that, the details dissolve into silence. All we can do is listen to the faint ticking of the genomic clock and wonder what the first sentence in human history might have been. Did we think before we spoke? It is a question that slips past the edges of archaeology and genetics and lands somewhere closer to philosophy. By the time we arrive at 135,000 years ago, the genomic evidence suggests that the biological scaffolding of language was already present. The lungs, the tongue, the ear, and the genes were ready. But readiness is not the same as use. A capacity can remain dormant until it finds purpose. What we do not know is whether early Homo sapiens were already speaking to one another in recognizable words, or whether, for a time, language first existed privately, as an internal tool for thought, before it spilled into the air as shared sound. One way to approach this mystery is to think about what language actually does for a brain. It does not simply label objects or help arrange hunting parties. It also builds inner landscapes. Even today, much of our language never reaches another ear. It turns silently in our heads as monologue, as rehearsal, as argument with ourselves. If language first took root in the brain as a way to shape thought, it may have been an internal technology before it became a social one. That is not to say early humans did not communicate. Gesture, expression, vocal cries, and imitation had been present for millions of years. But structured words, with consistent meaning and combinatorial power, may first have been the scaffolding for thought itself. There are hints from psychology that support this possibility. Experiments with children show that before they learn to speak outwardly, they rehearse language inwardly, a private babbling that helps organize perception and action. Vygotsky, the Russian psychologist of the early 20th century, proposed that inner speech is not a later byproduct, but the very foundation of higher cognition. If the same was true for early Homo sapiens, language may have existed first as silent rehearsal, a way of binding memory and planning into coherent streams. Only later would those private rehearsals have been shared in public, transforming into the collaborative tool we now take for granted. The archaeological record of this period is frustratingly thin on direct evidence. Words do not fossilize, and thoughts leave no trace. But around 100,000 years ago, we begin to see signs of symbolic behavior. Pigments collected, shells pierced, objects carried far from their origins. While none of these is proof of language, each suggests a mind that could connect an object with an abstract meaning. Symbolic capacity requires a system of internal representation, and language is the most efficient such system we know. The two may have co-evolved, with inner language helping to stabilize symbols, and symbols helping to externalize inner language. Genomic studies lend another perspective. By 135,000 years ago, neural networks associated with working memory and mental rehearsal were already modern. This suggests that the cognitive machinery for internal narrative was in place. If language was first an internal monologue, these brains were prepared to use it. The leap from private rehearsal to public word would then be cultural, not strictly biological. Groups had to agree on sounds, on conventions, on the fact that meaning could be shared at all. Such agreements may have taken generations to stabilize. For a long stretch, language might have existed in a twilight zone, robust inside the head, fragile outside of it. The haunting possibility is that countless private languages bloomed and died before a public one stabilized. Each individual may have had their own way of talking to themselves, a unique mapping of sound and thought, but without a shared code, those systems vanished with their owners. Only when enough overlap emerged between individuals could words live on in the community. This means that the birth of public language may have required not only biology, but a kind of cultural critical mass, a threshold where private systems began to align. We can imagine how this might have happened. A child experiments with sounds while rehearsing inner thoughts. A parent mimics the sound, giving it back with intention. Slowly, the private becomes public. What was once inner rehearsal gains external confirmation. Over time, repeated exchanges stabilize the mapping, and a shared code emerges. If this scenario is correct, then the period between 135,000 and 100,000 years ago was a crucible, the span when private languages began merging into public words. There is also the question of whether thought requires language at all. Some philosophers argue that we can think without words, that imagery, emotion, and motor representation are enough. Others argue that complex thought, counterfactuals, planning, narratives, depends on linguistic structure. If the latter is true, then the rise of private language was not just a side development, but the very moment when our minds became capable of the depth we now associate with humanity. This would mean that thinking as we know it began only when words, even silent ones, entered the brain. Before that, cognition would have been shallower, bound to the present, limited in scope. Evidence from brain imaging studies in modern humans shows that silent inner speech activates many of the same regions as spoken language. This suggests that once the neural circuits for language evolved, they were naturally co-opted for internal use. That co-option may have preceded their external deployment. In this view, thought and speech are not separate stages, but parallel uses of the same machinery. Which came first may be less important than the realization that the machinery can serve both. The question remains unresolved. Did we think before we spoke, or did speaking allow us to think? Perhaps the truth lies in a feedback loop. Early symbolic capacities required some inner system of representation, which could have been a proto-language of thought. That proto-language, once externalized, expanded social interaction, which in turn pressured cognition to grow more complex. The two co-evolved in a spiral, each driving the other forward. By 100,000 years ago, the spiral had tightened into a stable system. Private language feeding public words reinforcing private thought. The implications are profound. It suggests that language is not only a social technology, but also an intimate, solitary one. Each of us carries a voice that never stops speaking, that rehearses, narrates, doubts, and remembers. That voice may be as ancient as humanity itself, born in the silent gap between the genomic readiness for language and the cultural flowering of speech. If so, then every time we talk to ourselves, we are echoing a stage of evolution when words were still private, still fragile, still waiting to find their place in the public air. So did we think before we spoke? The evidence points to the possibility that we did, at least in some form during that critical span between 135,000 and 100,000 years ago. But like so much in prehistory, the answer is less a conclusion than an invitation to humility. We can measure genes, we can unearth shells, we can model neural networks, but the first private thought that shaped itself into the first public word remains forever unknown. All we can do is acknowledge that the capacity was there, that the transition was real, and that somewhere in that silent interval, the human mind learned to turn private language into public words. And the haunting question that lingers is this: if language once existed privately before it was spoken aloud, what thoughts, what silent worlds, were lost to time because no one ever heard them? What does a scratch on ochre say? To a modern eye, it might look like nothing more than a faint zigzag, a casual mark left without meaning. Yet in the archaeological layers of southern Africa, these scratches have provoked some of the most heated debates in the study of human origins. By around 100,000 years ago, people living near the southern coast of Africa were leaving behind traces that do not fit neatly into survival alone. Among the stone tools, the hearths, and the animal bones, we find lumps of ochre, iron-rich minerals ground and scraped, sometimes engraved, sometimes reduced to powder and spread on surfaces or bodies. What could this have meant? The most famous examples come from Blombos Cave, a small rock shelter overlooking the Indian Ocean. In the layers dated to about 75,000 years ago, archaeologists discovered pieces of ochre incised with crosshatched designs. These are not random scratches. They repeat, they form deliberate patterns, and they suggest intention. While earlier layers at the same site show ochre use as far back as 100,000 years ago, it is the engraved pieces that catch attention, because they whisper of something beyond function. Ochre has many possible uses. It can act as a preservative for hides, as a sunscreen, as an insect repellent, even as an ingredient in adhesives for hafting stone tools to wood. Any of these could explain why lumps of ochre show up so consistently at Middle Stone Age sites. But incising geometric patterns is not necessary for any of these functions. A line scratched into ochre does nothing for hide preservation or glue strength, which is why many researchers interpret these marks as symbolic. Not necessarily symbolic in the sense of complex language, but symbolic in the sense of meaning beyond immediate utility. If that is correct, then the marks on ochre are among the earliest material proxies we have for language. Not because the scratches are words, but because they show that the people who made them were capable of attaching abstract meaning to material objects. That capacity is essential for language. When we speak, we attach sound to meaning. When they scratched, they attached mark to meaning. It may not have been the same kind of communication, but it draws from the same mental reservoir. Blombos is not alone. At other sites in southern Africa, such as Pinnacle Point and Sibidu Cave, ochre has also been found in abundance. Some pieces show grinding facets, suggesting that they were powdered and possibly applied to skin or objects. The choice of ochre is telling. Its vivid red and yellow colours stand out in the natural world. To cover oneself in ochre is to be visibly different, to signal something to others. It could be a signal of group identity, of ritual, of status, or perhaps it was used in mourning or celebration. The precise meanings are lost, but the deliberate use of colour hints at a symbolic dimension. Shell beads from sites like Blombos, and still earlier at sites such as Border Cave, add another layer. Perforated shells, some stained with ochre, seem to have been strung and worn as ornaments. Like the scratches on ochre, beads go beyond survival. They communicate something social, belonging, display, identity, and like language, they rely on shared understanding. A bead only means something if others recognize it as such. This is why archaeologists often view beads as the clearest sign of symbolic behavior in early Homo sapiens. Around 100,000 years ago, these southern African populations were already marking themselves with signals that required shared codes. But how do we connect these archaeological traces to language itself? The cautious answer is that we cannot, not directly. A scratch on ochre is not a sentence, and a bead is not a verb. Yet both suggest that the minds of these people were operating in symbolic domains. They could take something from the natural world and turn it into a sign. That is precisely what language does with sound. So while we cannot claim that they were speaking in the way we do now, we can argue that they had crossed a threshold into symbolic thought that made language not only possible but likely. It is also striking how early these behaviours appear. For a long time, scholars assumed that symbolic expression began only around 50,000 years ago, often tied to European discoveries. The African evidence has rewritten that timeline. By 100,000 years ago, people were already scratching ochre, stringing beads, and perhaps covering themselves in colour. This pushes back the emergence of symbolic culture by tens of thousands of years and situates its roots firmly in Africa. Of course, skeptics remain. Some argue that the engravings at Blombos are too few and too simple to count as symbols. Perhaps they were idle doodles, or even functional marks like notches for counting. Others point out that ochre use could be purely practical, tied to hide processing or adhesive production, with no symbolic dimension at all. The problem is that the archaeological record gives us only fragments, and interpretation always risks reading too much into them. What looks like symbolism to us might have been something entirely different to them. Yet even with this caution, it is difficult to ignore the patterns. When ochre is found again and again, when beads are perforated in consistent ways, when engravings are repeated, the odds tilt toward intention. And when intention overlaps with visibility, when marks are made where others can see them, we're in the territory of communication. Whether that communication took the form of silent signals, ritual displays, or spoken words remains uncertain. But the archaeological record suggests that by 100,000 years ago, human communities were already experimenting with external symbols that could echo meaning across individuals. The haunting question is whether these echoes were accompanied by spoken language as we know it. Did the people of Blombos stand around a fire, their skins stained red with ochre, their shells clinking softly, and speak words recognizable as language? Or were their voices still confined to cries, gestures, and proto-words, while the ochre carried the burden of symbolism? We cannot know. But the very fact that we can ask the question tells us that the line between symbol and language was already being blurred in deep time. Perhaps the ochre marks were the first echoes of public language, material signs that stabilized private thoughts into communal meaning. Or perhaps they were a parallel system, a visual code that existed alongside a still developing spoken one. Either way, they remind us that language is not just sound. It is the broader human capacity to turn the world into symbols, to make marks and colours stand for things unseen. So what does a scratch on ochre say? To archaeologists, it says that 100,000 years ago, people were already thinking in ways that stretched beyond the here and now. To us, it says that language may leave echoes not only in speech, but also in scratches, beads, and colours. The marks may be silent, but they tell us that the minds that made them were already speaking in their own way. And the haunting question that lingers is this: if these were the first echoes of the language, how much of the conversation has been lost, ground away with the ochre, washed out of the shells, left only as faint scratches in stone? Did a late spark ignite speech? That has long been the story. For decades, textbooks spoke of a human revolution around 50,000 years ago, when fully modern behaviour supposedly appeared suddenly in Europe. In that model, symbolic art, advanced tools, complex language, and rapid dispersals all erupted in a single package, like a switch flipped in the human brain. The image is seductive because it is simple. One mutation, one moment, one explosion that separated us forever from every other hominin. But the evidence that has accumulated over the last few decades does not fit so neatly into that story. What we see instead is a slower, more incremental build-up that began long before 70,000 years ago and continued long after 40,000. The so-called explosion looks more like a long, uneven burn. Part of the confusion came from geography. Early excavations in Europe produced dramatic evidence. Painted caves, carved figurines, musical instruments. These were dated to about 40,000 years ago, and they seem to appear suddenly with the arrival of Homo sapiens on the continent. Neanderthals, in contrast, were often depicted as silent, uncreative, and doomed. From this vantage point, it was easy to imagine a revolution. Language arrived full-formed with us, and we spread it like wildfire. But deeper research in Africa, the Levant and Asia has revealed that many of the supposed explosive features were already present tens of thousands of years earlier. Ochre use, shell beads, engraved patterns, and sophisticated tools show up in African sites 100,000 years ago or more. These discoveries eroded the notion of a single spark. Another complication comes from the fossils themselves. When we look at the vocal anatomy of archaic humans, including Neanderthals and earlier species like 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐐𝐄, we find that the machinery for speech was already in place long before 40,000 years ago. Hyoid bones, ear canals tuned to speech frequencies, and the genetic presence of FOXP2 all point to capacities for complex vocalization that predate the supposed explosion. If language was a sudden invention, why did the scaffolding for it appear so much earlier? The simpler answer is that language itself also developed gradually, step by step, along with these capacities. There is also the question of population size and density. Around 70,000 years ago, Homo sapiens began to expand rapidly across Africa and beyond. Larger, more connected populations create fertile ground for cultural innovations to spread and stabilize. Language may not have been born then, but it could have flourished in new ways as groups became more numerous, more mobile, and more interactive. In this view, the apparent explosion is not the sudden birth of language, but the sudden visibility of its cultural effects. With more people leaving more artifacts, we simply find more evidence. The comparison with Neanderthals sharpens the picture. Evidence suggests that they too may have had capacities for symbolic thought and complex communication. Their tools were often sophisticated, they used pigments, and there are hints of personal ornaments. A few burial sites suggest ritual, or at least deliberate treatment of the dead. These are not the behaviours of mute brutes. It is reasonable to think that Neanderthals had their own forms of speech, perhaps less elaborated, perhaps differently structured, but not wholly absent. If that is true, then language cannot have been a late spark exclusive to Homo sapiens. It must have been smouldering across multiple lineages already. Why then does the myth of the explosion persist? Partly because dramatic stories are memorable. A single revolution is easier to teach than a slow accumulation. It also aligns with the human desire to see ourselves as unique, the chosen species marked by a sudden gift. But the weight of evidence argues against this neat story. The reality seems to be that language evolved gradually over hundreds of thousands of years, with roots deep in Africa and with parallel developments among other hominins. The 40,000-year mark is less a beginning than a threshold of visibility. When behaviours became widespread enough, durable enough, and archaeologically visible enough to leave a striking record, when we step back and look at the broader timeline, the story changes. Around 100,000 years ago, we see ochre engravings and beads in southern Africa. Around 70,000 years ago, populations expand, bringing language-rich cultures into new territories. By 60,000 years ago, humans are dispersing into Asia and Australia, carrying with them symbolic traditions. By 40,000 years ago, in Europe, those traditions appear dramatically in cave art and tools, but they are not sudden novelties. They are the flowering of much older roots. The supposed explosion is really the cumulative outcome of long processes that reached critical mass. This incremental view also explains why language today is not a single monolithic system, but a diversity of forms. If language had truly exploded in a single event, we might expect a uniform template passed down intact. Instead, we see endless variation, tonal languages, click consonants, signed systems, whistled speech. Such diversity suggests deep time, gradual divergence, and long local evolution. Each community shaped its own communication, and over tens of thousands of years those differences multiplied. Language is not the product of a single spark, but of many fires burning in many places, some merging, some fading, some still glowing today. One of the most intriguing questions is what role contact between sapiens and Neanderthals played. When modern humans arrived in Europe around 45,000 years ago, they encountered populations that had been there for hundreds of thousands of years. These were not strangers to vocal communication. What happened when two language-capable species met? Did they exchange words, gestures, or intonations? Did they misunderstand each other completely? The archaeological record cannot tell us, but it raises fascinating possibilities. If Neanderthals had language of their own, then the explosion in Europe might actually represent the collision of two traditions, not the sudden appearance of one. So did a late spark ignite speech? The honest answer is no. Language was not born suddenly between 70,000 and 40,000 years ago. Instead, it grew in layers, from gestures in primates, to vocal capacities in earlier hominins, to symbolic material culture in Africa, to expanded cultural transmission in growing populations. What we see around 40,000 years ago is simply the most visible tip of a much longer and deeper process. The haunting question is why we long for an explosion at all. Perhaps it is because we want language to be as dramatic as it feels. The power to speak does seem like a miracle, so we imagine it must have begun with one. But the evidence teaches a different lesson. Miracles can be gradual. The slow burn of countless small innovations, spread across time and species, can add up to something that feels explosive in hindsight. Our own voices, shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, are not the product of a single spark but of an ancient fire that never went out. And so the Babel explosion that wasn't leaves us with a different kind of wonder. Not a sudden gift, but a long, fragile weaving. Not a single dawn, but a slow brightening. If the people of 70,000 years ago could hear us today, they might not be surprised. They had already been speaking for far longer than we once dared to admit. The only surprise is that we still tell ourselves stories of explosions when the truth, written quietly in ochre and echo, is of embers glowing all along. How do words become rules? This is one of the most puzzling thresholds in the story of language. A grunt can mean something. A gesture can signal something. But rules are different. Rules allow us to combine small signals into larger ones, to string together meaning in ways that multiply endlessly. Somewhere between 70,000 and 30,000 years ago, the scattered sparks of proto-language began to form into a fire of syntax. It was not just naming objects anymore. It was ordering them, relating them, embedding them. The shift was not from silence to speech, but from list to stories. Reconstructing this threshold is hard because grammar does not fossilize. We can see ochre scratches, we can hold beads in our hands, but we cannot unearth the order in which words were once placed. What we rely on instead are indirect traces, the kinds of artifacts that suggest planning and cooperation, the genetic scaffolding for vocal control, and the comparative patterns in modern languages. None of these is conclusive on its own, but together they give us hints that by this period humans were no longer speaking in loose strings of single words. They were arranging them into structures that carried not just meanings, but relationships between meanings. One of the most striking properties of human language is recursion, the ability to place one clause inside another. This allows for infinite variation. The bird that flew over the tree that shaded the river where the hunters waited. Recursion is not necessary for basic communication, but it is necessary for layered thought, for embedding cause and effect, for handling conditionals and hypotheticals. The archaeological record between 70,000 and 30,000 years ago begins to suggest minds capable of such layering. Complex hunting strategies, long-distance resource transport, and the careful sequencing of tool production all point toward cognitive abilities that mirror recursive structures. Language may have grown alongside these tasks, shaping and being shaped by them. Equally important was the emergence of order. In every language today, words fall into patterns: subject, verb, object, verb, subject, object, or some variation. These are not arbitrary. They reflect constraints of cognition and memory. It is easier to follow who did what to whom if the elements are arranged consistently. Without such order, sentences collapse into chaos. The spread of stable populations in Africa, Asia, and Europe around this time provided the conditions for such conventions to form and take hold. Proto-language could have been fluid, with gestures and words strung together on the fly. Grammar, by contrast, requires shared expectations. You know where to look for the actor in the sentence, where to place the action, where to expect the object. Those expectations are not genetic in detail, but cultural, learned by each child. The very fact that humans could stabilize them suggests that by this period we were already immersed in communities where grammar was normal. A haunting thought is that grammar may have emerged first in the home, in the quiet exchanges between parents and children. A single word can point, but to tell a child to fetch something, or to warn that a predator is approaching from behind, order is needed. The evolution of the longer childhoods in Homo sapiens would have created countless opportunities for structured teaching, for repetitive phrasing, for scaffolding meaning with syntax. This kind of environment would not leave a fossil record, yet it may have been the crucible where grammar first hardened. Comparisons with other hominins again offer perspective. If Neanderthals had vocal tracts capable of complex speech, as evidence increasingly suggests, did they also have grammar? Some argue yes, pointing to their technological skills and possible symbolic behaviours. Others argue that their cultural record shows less evidence of rapid innovation, implying that their communication may have lacked the recursive depth of Homo sapiens. The truth is, we do not know. What we do know is that by 30,000 years ago, Homo sapiens spread across multiple continents with languages complex enough to survive, diversify, and endure. The universals we see today, word order, parts of speech, recursive embedding, almost certainly had roots in that period. It is also telling that music and language likely intertwined in this era. The construction of bone flutes in Europe more than 35,000 years ago demonstrates not just tonal awareness but sequencing. Music, like grammar, is rule-based. Notes follow patterns, motifs repeat, structures organize. A community capable of producing instruments and teaching their use is also a community living within rules. Some scholars suggest that musical practice may have provided the cognitive scaffolding for syntax, training memory and sequencing abilities that later translated into grammar. Whether that is true or not, the coexistence of both points toward a shared mental space where pattern and structure became second nature. Another angle comes from gesture. Proto-language was probably multimodal, mixing sounds with hand movements and facial expressions. Even today, gestures naturally accompany speech, but the reliance on gesture diminishes as grammar strengthens. Once word order carries the necessary structure, the hands are freed to emphasize rather than to encode. This shift may have occurred during the period between 70,000 and 30,000 years ago, as vocal communication became rich enough to carry full meaning. It does not mean gesture disappeared, but it ceased to be essential. Grammar gave the tongue the power once shared with the hands. A difficult question is whether grammar emerged gradually or in leaps. Did people go from two-word strings to full sentences step by step? Or was there a threshold effect where once a certain cognitive capacity was reached, syntax blossomed rapidly? Both models have their defenders. Some point to child language acquisition today, where children move quickly from hollow phrases to complex sentences once they grasp basic order. Others note that language change in history shows gradual shifts, suggesting a slower process. Perhaps both are true. The capacity may have developed slowly over evolutionary time, but once in place, each child could acquire grammar quickly within their community. That would explain why all modern children learn the complex rules of their native language without formal instruction. By the end of this period, language was no longer just a string of names or commands. It was capable of narrative. Narrative requires grammar. You cannot tell a story with isolated words. You need subjects, verbs, objects, temporal markers, conditional clauses. You need to say who did what, when, and why. The ability to tell stories may have been the defining leap of this era. Stories carry lessons, warnings, shared histories, imagined futures. They require and reinforce grammar at the same time. To live in a world of stories is to live in a world where grammar is indispensable. The haunting question is how different our lives would be if grammar had never stabilized. Imagine a world where communication never rose above word strings, where every exchange was pointing and naming without structure. Could such a society build large-scale cooperation? Could it preserve traditions across generations? Could it imagine futures beyond immediate experience? Probably not. Grammar is what allowed language to transcend the here and now. Without it, words would remain tied to objects and events in sight. With it, they became bridges to the unseen, the remembered, the imagined. So how do words become rules? The evidence suggests it was not a sudden invention, but the cumulative product of many small shifts. Vocal anatomy reaching maturity, social groups stabilizing, long childhoods providing a crucible for learning, cognitive sequencing skills refined by toolmaking and music, and the gradual conventionalization of order in speech. By 30,000 years ago, humans were not just speaking, but speaking grammatically. They had moved from grunts to grammar, from signals to systems, from naming to narrating. The miracle is not that grammar appeared suddenly, but that it grew quietly, woven into daily life until it became invisible, assumed, expected. And the haunting question lingers. If grammar was a human invention rather than a genetic gift, does that mean it could have evolved differently? Could there have been languages without recursion, without order, without rules as we know them? Or was grammar an inevitable outcome once the brain reached a certain threshold of complexity? We cannot know, but what we do know is that the rules you are hearing right now in this sentence were not inevitable. They were made slowly, painfully, joyfully, by people tens of thousands of years ago who decided, perhaps without realizing, that words alone were not enough. Would you understand them if they spoke? That is perhaps the most tantalizing question we can ask of the Upper Paleolithic, the age stretching between 40,000 and 30,000 years ago, when Homo sapiens fully entered Europe and left behind some of the richest traces of behaviour we have ever uncovered. It is in this period that archaeologists speak of a symbolic explosion, a sudden flowering of objects, carvings or ornaments and sounds that seem unmistakably human in their depth and diversity. If we could be transported back into one of those icy valleys, into a firelit shelter or a painted cave, would the voices we heard sound familiar, not just in tone but in structure? Would their words, though strange to our ears, carry the recognizable cadence of grammar, rhythm and syntax? The first clue is in the sheer variety of symbolic artifacts. Across Europe, from France to Russia, we find carved ivory figures, strings of beads, pierced teeth worn as necklaces and carefully shaped pendants. These are not utilitarian tools but communicative objects. They send signals about identity, about belonging, about shared myths. To maintain such a system requires language capable of subtle distinctions, capable of narrating not only the function of an object, but the stories and rules that surround it. A bead by itself is only decoration. A bead within a cultural code is a message, and messages require words. Then there is music. In caves such as Hohlefels and 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐓𝐀𝐌𝐏𝐒 in Germany, archaeologists uncovered flutes made from bird bone and mammoth ivory, dated to more than 35,000 years ago. These instruments are not crude whistles, but carefully hollowed finger-holed tools capable of producing a range of notes. To produce and teach music like this requires structured sequences, rules of repetition and variation. The same cognitive architecture that enables melody also enables syntax. And perhaps more importantly, music brings groups together in ritual and in memory, just as language does. A community that could carve flutes and pass down melodies almost certainly could pass down stories as well. Ornaments and music suggest symbolic thought, but what of spoken words? Fossil evidence shows that anatomically modern humans in this period already had the vocal tract and neurological capacity for complex speech. By 40,000 years ago, the anatomical prerequisites were not the limiting factor. Culture was. The spread of Homo sapiens into Europe coincides with a burst of creativity that seems inseparable from language. Narratives were likely used to explain cave paintings, to instruct apprentices in blade production, to coordinate hunts across snowy landscapes. The number of tasks requiring explicit instruction alone suggests that language was more than a collection of single words. It had become fully syntactic. Consider the caves of Chauvet and later Lascaux. While we must avoid projecting too much modern symbolism onto their walls, what cannot be denied is that these images were meant to endure. To create them required preparation, planning, and probably communal participation, and to make sense of them would have required words. A painted bison may have been explained with a narrative about hunting, about ritual, about spirit worlds. Whatever those stories were, they demanded more than simple pointing. They demanded narrative grammar. It is tempting to imagine stepping into one of these gatherings and hearing the voices around the fire. The words would be alien, the vocabulary unrecognizable, but the structure might carry echoes of familiarity. Rising tones for questions, ordering of subject and verb, particles marking tense or mood. These are universals across the world's languages today, suggesting they may have already stabilized by 30,000 years ago. If you listened closely, you might not grasp the meanings, but you might feel the rhythm of conversation, the turn-taking, the pauses that let another speak. Those patterns are deeply human, and they were almost certainly present then. Another angle comes from population size and social complexity. As Homo sapiens spread through Europe, groups would have grown larger and more interconnected than before. Larger groups mean greater demands on communication. Proto-language might suffice for a small band, but coordinating multifamily networks, long-distance exchange, and complex rituals requires greater linguistic power. Anthropologists estimate that once group size exceeds a few dozen, a fully grammatical language becomes almost inevitable for stability. By the time humans were burying their dead with ornaments and exchanging exotic shells across regions, grammar was no longer optional. It was the scaffolding of society. Still, we must be cautious. The archaeological record gives us indirect proxies, not direct recordings. It is possible that some of what we call symbolic explosion was regional variation, and that language had already been fully modern for tens of thousands of years in Africa before entering Europe. The beads of Blombos Cave in southern Africa, dating to nearly 100,000 years ago, already suggest symbolic communication far earlier. What the European record shows us may not be the birth of language, but its elaboration under new conditions. If so, then the voices of 40,000 years ago were not the first modern voices, but simply the first we recognise through abundant material traces. What would those voices have sounded like? Phonetically, they would have been capable of the full range of consonants and vowels we know today. There is no reason to assume they lacked S, or K, or M. The distribution of sounds across languages today shows deep variation, but all draw from the same biological potential. So the people of this era likely spoke languages rich in consonant clusters, vowel contrasts, and tonal or rhythmic variation. They could form questions, mark negation, indicate past and future, all through the arrangement of sounds into rules. In other words, their speech would not have sounded like grunts or primitive cries. It would have sounded like language. Yet the haunting question remains. Would we understand them if they spoke? Not in the literal sense, since no vocabulary from that age survives, but in structure, in cadence, in rhythm. Yes. We would likely hear exchanges that felt strangely familiar, the way hearing an unrelated modern language feels at once alien and human. We would hear the laughter of timing, the sharpness of scolding, the warmth of reassurance. These social uses of language are universal, and they surely bound together the groups who survived Europe's harsh Ice Age landscapes. And what if their languages have no descendants today? Languages, like species, can vanish. Entire families of speech may have flourished and disappeared without leaving a trace. The tongues of the Aurignacian or Gravettian cultures may be forever lost, their words buried with the people who once spoke them. That silence is sobering, because it reminds us that the recognisable voices of 40,000 years ago were not the ancestors of all modern tongues. Some were dead ends, like rivers that dry into sand. But for the people who spoke them, those languages were as full and meaningful as any alive today. The deeper resolution is that by this time, language had crossed the threshold from potential to permanence. It was not a fragile innovation, but a deeply rooted capacity that no longer depended on individual invention. Every child born into these societies would acquire grammar as naturally as they acquired walking. The cycle of learning and teaching ensured continuity, and in that continuity lies the answer. Yes, the voices of this period were voices we would recognise, not in their words, but in their humanness. So we return to the haunting question. Would you understand them if they spoke? Vocabulary, number, structure, yes. Emotion, almost certainly. Their words are gone, but their cadences live on in us, and perhaps if you sat by their fire long enough, you would begin to pick out the grammar, the rhythm, the rules beneath the sound. It might take weeks or months, but eventually you would laugh at their jokes, understand their warnings, follow their stories. The first voices we would recognise are still echoing faintly in the way we all speak today. If all humans once had one voice, why did it splinter? That is the mystery that sits at the heart of human language today. Around the world there are thousands of distinct languages, each with its own sounds, structures and rules. Some are tonal, some rely on word order, some string long words together while others prefer short syllables. Yet if the evidence from genetics and archaeology is correct, all of us descend from a population that lived in Africa less than 100,000 years ago. That population could not have spoken 10,000 tongues. At most it spoke one, or perhaps a small handful. So the puzzle is not only how language emerged, but how it fractured into so many mutually unintelligible forms. One answer lies in geography. When Homo sapiens dispersed from Africa after 70,000 years ago, groups began moving in different directions. Some followed the coasts of Arabia and South Asia, others pushed into the Levant, and still others fanned out into Central Asia, Siberia, and later Europe. With every migration came isolation. Groups cut off from one another had no reason to preserve identical speech patterns. Over generations, accents thickened, pronunciation shifted, and new words entered the lexicon. What began as small drifts eventually hardened into separate languages. Just as rivers divide and branch, so did speech. But the branching was not only passive, language also became a marker of belonging, a kind of fortress against outsiders. To speak the same tongue was to signal trust and kinship. To speak differently was to stand apart. The linguist Michael Corballis suggested that language did not just evolve to communicate, but also to exclude. In this view, languages multiply because humans want boundaries. A dialect can serve as a password, allowing insiders to recognize one another, while making it harder for strangers to infiltrate. In small groups facing competition over resources, such subtle boundaries could mean survival. Imagine two groups of hunters meeting in a valley. They share ancestry, but have been separated for hundreds of years. Their words for fire, water, and spear have drifted apart. When they try to speak, misunderstandings pile up. They may still trade cautiously, but they are unlikely to merge into a single community. Each group retreats to its own territory, and their languages continue to diverge. By creating distance in sound, language maintains distance in identity. The archaeological record gives us only indirect glimpses of this process, but the pattern is consistent. As Homo sapiens spread into new regions, cultural traditions diversified. Stone tool types, ornaments, and artistic styles all began to vary regionally. The same forces likely applied to language. Just as a bead style in one valley looked different from the beads 1,000 kilometers away, so the words spoken in one valley would have sounded strange in another. Culture is rarely static, and language is one of its most changeable elements. We can see a hint of this in how fast languages change today. Even without geographic isolation, dialects can split within a few centuries. Given that human groups in the Upper Paleolithic often lived in small scattered bands with little long-distance contact, the pace of divergence must have been even faster. The speech of one generation's children might already sound quaint to their grandparents. Multiply that drift over thousands of years and the outcome is inevitable, a patchwork of tongues. Another factor is innovation. Language is not just a system of rules, but also a playground for creativity. People coin new words, bend grammar, and invent slang. In small groups, these innovations can spread quickly and become permanent. What began as a playful metaphor might solidify into everyday vocabulary. If no external pressure enforces conformity, local speech communities happily follow their own path. In this way, divergence is the natural state of language. It takes extraordinary forces, such as empires or mass education, to keep large populations speaking in unison. None of those forces existed in the Pleistocene. So why did language splinter? Because humans moved, because humans marked boundaries, and because humans are endlessly inventive. Yet behind those simple causes lies something deeper. Diversity itself may have been adaptive. A group with a distinctive language could preserve its own myths, rituals, and knowledge systems without fear of dilution. Language tied together memory and identity. It ensured that one group's sacred stories did not easily leak into another's. In that sense, linguistic diversity was not a bug but a feature of human survival. Still, we must be careful not to imagine the past as more divided than it was. Some level of mutual intelligibility surely existed between neighbouring groups. Much as modern dialects can shade gradually into one another across regions, the languages of the Pleistocene likely formed chains rather than isolated islands. A traveller moving from one valley to the next might manage with effort, but by the time they crossed several territories, communication would break down entirely. This gradient explains both how trade networks could function and how languages still multiplied. There is also the matter of time. From 70,000 years ago to today spans more than twice the time between the Roman Empire and the present. In that immense stretch, even stable languages would have morphed beyond recognition. Every word you speak now is the descendant of words spoken by ancestors who would no longer understand you. That is not a flaw in language, but its essence. It lives only in use, and use means change. We should also consider the emotional power of speech. The particular sounds of a language can evoke belonging, intimacy, and comfort. They shape how a child feels about home and kin. When groups split, these emotional associations help cement differences. To abandon one's mother tongue is to risk abandoning one's community. So even when contact between groups occurred, full linguistic merging was rare. People hold on to the sounds of home even in the face of outside pressure. That stubborn loyalty, repeated over millennia, guaranteed diversity. Genetics confirms this picture in its own way. Just as human populations spread and differentiated across continents, so too did their languages. The branching of genetic lineages and the branching of speech likely marched in parallel. Though the two do not map perfectly, the correlation is striking. Populations that became isolated genetically also became isolated linguistically. The voices of humanity diversified as its genes did, locked together in the same slow dance of drift and separation. Could it have been otherwise? Could all humans have spoken a single global language? Perhaps for a brief moment in Africa before dispersal, yes. But once the Great Migrations began, divergence was unstoppable. There was no world government, no global trade, no internet to enforce uniformity. Only small bands of foragers, each carrying their own words into the wilderness. The miracle is not that languages split, but that they ever lasted long enough to be passed down at all. Today, when we hear about the extinction of languages, it is tempting to mourn a modern tragedy. And it is. Yet from the perspective of deep time, language death is nothing new. Most of the tongues ever spoken are gone. They lived for a while in the mouths of small groups, then vanished with them. The number of living languages today, though vast, is only a shadow of the countless voices lost. Diversity has always been accompanied by disappearance. So why so many tongues? Because speech is not just about transmitting information. It is about shaping identity. Every group that stepped into a new valley, crossed a river, or survived a harsh winter carried its own words forward, polishing them into something unique. Those words became the walls of their world, the sound of their community, the fortress that kept strangers at bay. Out of one ancestral voice came thousands, each a testament to human separation and human creativity. The haunting question that remains is whether we should imagine this diversity as a loss or a gift. From one perspective, fragmentation obscures our shared origin. From another, it is precisely what makes humanity rich and resilient. A single language might have bound us tightly, but many languages allowed us to adapt, to preserve, to innovate in parallel. Perhaps it is not a tragedy that the one voice splintered, but a necessity. Without that splintering, we might not have survived at all. Are words evolving like genes? It is a strange question, but one that has drawn more than a few scientists to take it seriously. The British evolutionary biologist Mark Pagel once suggested that languages follow some of the same rules that guide biological evolution. In this view, the sounds and words we use are not just arbitrary noises, but lineages that change, compete, and survive much like species. They can mutate into new forms, vanish into extinction, or persist for astonishing spans of time. To trace a word's history is a little like reading genetic code, only the code is spoken and heard rather than written in molecules. The implication is that language itself is an organism of sorts, carried inside us but also evolving outside us, subject to the same relentless forces of descent with modification. The hook for this idea lies in the way language changes. Take any word, and over time it drifts. Consonants soften, vowels shift, meanings broaden or contract. What was once familiar to ancestors becomes alien to descendants, yet the continuity is still there, a thread that can be followed across generations. This resembles the way DNA mutates slowly, sometimes imperceptibly, until two lineages diverge into new species. Language is not genetic in a literal sense, but its patterns of inheritance carry the same signature of branching descent. This is why linguists can construct family trees of words that so closely resemble phylogenetic trees of species. If we step back to 200,000 years ago, when anatomically modern humans were spreading within Africa, the idea becomes tantalizing. Those people must have spoken some kind of language, though we cannot know its words. Whatever it was, it represents the ancestral tongue of all that followed. From that single origin point, lineages of speech diverged again and again, just as human populations themselves did. When small groups split off, their speech mutated independently. Over many millennia, the soundscape diversified, giving rise to thousands of languages whose histories mirror those of the people who spoke them. Pagel argued that words themselves undergo a kind of natural selection. Some words are highly stable, surviving tens of thousands of years with little change. Others mutate rapidly, replaced by alternatives every few centuries. Why? Stability seems to correlate with frequency and necessity. Words for kinship, body parts, or essential pronouns tend to persist. For example, terms for mother, man, or two often trace deep lineages across widely separated languages. They are like genetic sequences coding for vital proteins, too essential to change quickly. In contrast, words for more peripheral concepts like dirty or push mutate quickly. These are like genes that tolerate greater variability because survival does not hinge on their exact form. We can even measure the approximate half-life of words. Pagel's team once estimated that common core vocabulary words can remain stable for as long as 10 to 20,000 years. This is staggering when one considers how many times languages fracture and drift. It means that some of the words you speak today may echo faintly back into the Ice Age, their forms recognizable to ancestors who lived before written history. To call them fossils of sound is not far from the truth. The metaphor of DNA is helpful here. Just as mutations accumulate in genetic sequences, sound shifts accumulate in words. One famous example is the great vowel shift in English, when the pronunciation of long vowels transformed over a few centuries in medieval Europe. But smaller shifts happen constantly in every language. A P becomes an F, a T becomes a TH. These sound laws are not random but patterned, allowing linguists to reconstruct ancestral forms much as geneticists reconstruct ancestral genomes. This is why scholars can rebuild proto-languages like Proto-Indo-European, not from inscriptions but from systematic comparison of daughter languages. The same method applies across language families, even in the absence of writing. What this suggests is that words can be treated as data, as replicators whose lifespans can be tracked. Unlike genes, however, words are not passed biologically but culturally. They spread horizontally between groups, borrowed and shared as easily as they are inherited vertically from parents. This makes language evolution messier than genetic evolution, but it also makes it fascinating. Where genes are locked into sexual reproduction, words can leap across boundaries at will. A conquering empire, a trading port, or a migrating clan can export vocabulary into entirely new lineages. In that sense, words behave both like genes and like viruses, endlessly replicating and occasionally crossing into new hosts. If language is aural DNA, then what are its mutations? They are the slips of the tongue that become fashion, the novel metaphors that become ordinary, the accidental mishearings that children turn into new norms. Over time, these small errors accumulate into permanent change. Just as mutations in DNA are blind to future utility, so too are linguistic shifts. No one decided that English should lose case endings, or that French should drop most of its consonants. It simply happened through countless small deviations, none planned, each driven by usage patterns that favoured simplicity or ease of articulation. Out of these blind shifts emerged entirely new structures, just as new species emerge from genetic drift and selection. This framework also explains the death of languages. When a language loses its speakers, it disappears as completely as a vanished species. Its words stop replicating. Its sound DNA goes extinct. The silence that follows is final, unless some fragment is preserved in writing or borrowed into another tongue. And just as with species, the extinction of languages is common. Most of the world's languages that ever existed are gone, their oral DNA lost beyond recovery. Those that survive today are a fraction of the diversity that once filled the human soundscape. We can also flip the metaphor to think about survival. What makes a word persist? Just as genes survive if they increase reproductive success, words survive if they increase communicative success. A short, efficient word has an advantage over a long, clumsy one. A word that is pleasing to say may spread more easily than one that is awkward. Rhymes, alliteration, and rhythm can all help words stick, much as attractive traits help genes spread through sexual selection. In this sense, language is subject not just to functional selection, but also to aesthetic pressures. Humans like certain sounds, and those sounds tend to thrive. One can even argue that stories and myths act like chromosomes, carrying clusters of words together across generations. When a tale is told, its phrases and cadences are replicated. They mutate slowly as storytellers add their flourishes, but the backbone remains. Over centuries, this creates lineages of narrative DNA, branching and drifting while preserving some deep core. Language here is not just a tool for communication, but a living archive, its survival dependent on the willingness of humans to keep speaking and retelling. The analogy between language and DNA also extends to rates of change. Just as some genetic sequences are conserved across species for millions of years, some words remain nearly unchanged across continents. The famous case is the root for mother, which appears in remarkably similar form across Indo-European, Afro-Asiatic and Dravidian families. The reason is obvious. Every human community needs a word for the woman who gives birth. That universality preserves it, just as genetic conservation preserves the most vital proteins. But where genes follow chemical rules, words follow social ones. A language may change rapidly if its speakers seek to distance themselves from outsiders. Entire sound systems can be reshaped in a few centuries under the pressure of identity. We see this in how dialects become political boundaries, or how subcultures twist language deliberately to mark separation. In those cases, the mutations are not blind but chosen, though still subject to the larger forces of survival and extinction. Does this mean that languages can be studied like genomes, with statistical models tracing their divergence? To some degree, yes. Computational linguistics has borrowed methods from evolutionary biology to map out family trees of languages. By measuring the rates at which words mutate, researchers can estimate when two languages diverged, much like the molecular clock in genetics. Pagel's model of language as aural DNA suggests that this analogy is not merely metaphorical but structurally real. The mathematics of inheritance, drift and divergence apply equally well to sounds as to genes. Still, there are limits. Language can leap across populations in a way genes cannot. A child can adopt a language with no relation to their ancestry. This makes linguistic history less tree-like and more like a web, with constant cross-pollination. Words are borrowed, traded, and reshaped in ways that defy neat branching. So while the metaphor of DNA is powerful, it is not perfect. Language is freer, more fluid, and more entangled with culture than genes could ever be. And yet, when we step back and listen to the broad sweep of history, the resemblance is uncanny. 200,000 years ago, there was likely only one or a handful of ancestral languages. Today, there are thousands. Along the way, words have lived and died, mutated and stabilized, replicated and vanished. Their trajectories resemble the grand story of life itself. They are the oral DNA of humanity, tracing who we were, who we are, and who we might become. The haunting question is whether words like genes will continue to diversify, or whether they will collapse into uniformity. Genes diversify naturally unless constrained by extinction. Words diversify naturally unless constrained by power. Today, with mass media and global communication, the forces of uniformity are stronger than ever. In a sense, our oral DNA may be undergoing a bottleneck, a reduction in diversity as a few dominant languages overshadow the rest. If so, the future may hold fewer voices, fewer lineages of sound, fewer living fossils carried in speech. So perhaps the better question is not whether words evolve like genes, but whether we will allow them to keep evolving freely. Are we the caretakers of language's DNA, or are we its extinction event? The answer is not yet clear, but the parallel remains. Words, like genes, are alive only as long as we pass them on. Why didn't humans invent 20 million words? It seems like an obvious path. If language was the secret to survival, why not arm ourselves with an endless arsenal of specialized sounds, each tied neatly to every single object, action, or feeling in the world? One word for every tree, another for every kind of wind, still more for each season of the river or every wrinkle of the sky. After all, our brains hold billions of neurons. Surely there was no limit to how many words we could keep inside them. Yet language did not go that way. Instead, every language on Earth contains only tens of thousands of words, a mere sliver of what is theoretically possible. From those few words, however, humans can build an infinite range of meanings. This is the paradox at the heart of what researchers like Richard Futrell have called the simplicity bottleneck. The reveal lies in the strange fact that language is not a catalogue of the world, but a system for combining pieces. It operates with constraints. Instead of memorizing countless individual signals, humans discovered, or perhaps stumbled into, the idea of rules. With a small set of rules and a limited stock of words, we can produce an unlimited number of sentences. This is the combinatorial power of syntax. It means that one does not need a different word for the wolf ran quickly, the wolf ran slowly, and the wolf did not run at all. With a finite lexicon and structural rules, those meanings can be assembled on demand. Language thus survives by being simple. Its simplicity is not a weakness, but the very condition that makes it limitless. Futrell's idea of the simplicity bottleneck frames this as a neurological reality. Our brains, for all their size, cannot juggle unlimited arbitrary associations. If we had 20 million words, we would never find the right one quickly enough, nor pass it down reliably to the next generation. Memory would collapse under the weight of its own vocabulary. Speech would become noise without structure. Instead, language evolved to balance memory and expression. The bottleneck means we store only as many words as we can easily retrieve, and we rely on rules to do the rest of the heavy lifting. This explains why all human languages are structured. None of them are just bags of unconnected sounds. Even the simplest known languages, spoken by small groups, use grammar, recursion, and ordered patterns. There is no evidence anywhere in the ethnographic record of a language with millions of unstructured signals. Simplicity forced us into complexity of a different kind. We had to invent a system where little parts could build big meanings. The elegance of this system is that it allows infinite creativity from finite means. Consider an analogy. Imagine a box of coloured tiles. If you have 20 million tiles, each a different shade, it becomes impossible to use them efficiently. You forget which shade stands for what. But if you have only a few dozen tiles and clear rules for combining them, you can produce mosaics of endless variety. The richness comes not from the number of pieces, but from the rules for assembling them. That, in essence, is the simplicity bottleneck at work. Evidence for this can be seen in how children acquire language. Infants do not memorize an endless word list. They begin with babbling, then single words, then combinations. Soon they grasp that words can be slotted together according to rules, and from there they generate sentences they have never heard before. This generative leap shows that the bottleneck is not merely cultural but cognitive. The human brain expects structure. It thrives on the economy of rules. Without that economy, speech would collapse into a million disconnected fragments. Archaeology offers indirect support as well. When we look at the symbolic artifacts from around 100,000 years ago, the ochre engravings, shell beads and carved objects, we see repeated motifs rather than infinite variation. Humans gravitated towards structured systems even in symbolism. That may reflect the same neurological bottleneck. Memory prefers patterns. Communication prefers regularity. In both language and art, infinite meaning emerges from finite sets of parts. Another angle comes from computational modelling. Futrell and colleagues used computer simulations to show that languages under cognitive constraints naturally evolve towards simplicity. When memory limits are applied, languages converge on systems with small vocabularies and productive rules. Without those limits, the simulations produced chaotic and inefficient codes. This suggests that the simplicity bottleneck is not just a quirk of history, but a necessity of information processing. The bottleneck also explains why languages converge on certain universal features. Nearly every language, for example, has ways to mark who did what to whom. Nearly every language has pronouns, tenses, and ways of negating. These are not coincidences, but adaptations to the need for efficient combinatorial expression. A system with too many irregularities or redundancies becomes harder to learn and remember, and thus less likely to persist. Over time, languages simplify in some areas while elaborating in others, always balancing the tension between memory and expressivity. This does not mean languages are static. They change constantly, adding new words and shedding old ones. But the size of the lexicon rarely grows beyond the tens of thousands. Even in modern technological societies, Where new words appear every day, the bottleneck remains. We invent compound words, metaphors and phrases to expand meaning, rather than adding millions of standalone terms. The rule-based system is too efficient to abandon. The haunting implication is that simplicity may have been the key that unlocked human language in the first place. Early hominins could have used dozens or even hundreds of distinct calls, much like primates do today. But once cognitive pressures forced a limit, the only way forward was to discover combinatorial rules. That discovery, or gradual shift, turned a finite system into an infinite one. Instead of being trapped by the bottleneck, humans used it to transcend it. Yet humility is necessary here. We do not know exactly when or how this happened. Was it a gradual cultural evolution, where groups slowly streamlined their signals until rules emerged? Or was it a neurological shift that made rules inevitable once brains reached a certain size? The evidence is indirect, pieced together from cognitive science, archaeology, and comparative linguistics. What is clear, however, is that no known human language, ancient or modern, escaped the bottleneck. All of them rely on limited vocabularies combined through rules. One might ask, could another species have broken through the bottleneck? Could dolphins or birds, with their immense repertoires of calls, have developed languages with millions of words? The answer seems to be no, because without combinatorial structure, those repertoires remain finite. A dolphin may have dozens of whistles, a bird hundreds of songs, but none of these systems generate infinite novelty. The bottleneck is universal, and the escape route is singular. Structure. Humans took it, others did not. There is also a cultural dimension to the bottleneck. Societies that try to preserve massive vocabularies, such as elaborate naming systems or honorifics, always fold them into rules. The result is not a dictionary of endless words, but a rule-based way of constructing terms. Even complexity is rule-governed. This shows that the bottleneck is not just neurological but social. Groups cannot maintain massive arbitrary vocabularies without collapsing into confusion. They streamline and regulate. The simplicity bottleneck acts as a brake on linguistic inflation. Perhaps the most elegant demonstration of the bottleneck is in poetry and song. A poem does not use millions of words. It often uses only a few, repeated and rearranged with rhythm and structure. Yet from those few, it can evoke entire universes of meaning. The bottleneck is not an obstacle to beauty, but a condition for it. Without it, there would be no space for metaphor, for layering, for resonance. The power of language lies not in the number of its words, but in the way they combine. In the end, the simplicity bottleneck is a reminder of our limits. We did not evolve infinite memory or infinite speech. We evolved something more subtle, the ability to make infinity from finitude. By accepting the bottleneck, humans unlock the vast landscape of grammar, syntax, and creativity. That is why we did not invent 20 million words. We did not need to. With a few thousand and a set of rules, we could build worlds. And the haunting question remains, what other bottlenecks shaped us without our noticing? If language was born not from abundance but from constraint, then perhaps the deepest powers of our species emerge not from what we can do, but from what we cannot. Did farming shrink the world's voices? That is the haunting question at the beginning of the Holocene, when human societies shifted from living by hunting and gathering to cultivating crops and herding animals. Around 10,000 years ago, in scattered valleys and plains from the Fertile Crescent to the Yellow River, from the highlands of New Guinea to the savannas of Africa, groups of humans began to live differently. They stopped moving as much. They cleared fields, planted seeds, and built villages that would grow into towns, and in doing so they may have set in motion one of the largest linguistic transformations in human history. The reveal is that farming did not just change diets and settlement patterns, it may also have reduced the number of languages spoken on Earth. For most of the Paleolithic, when humans lived in small, mobile bands, language diversity was astonishing. Each group of a few dozen or a few hundred people could maintain its own way of speaking. Dialects and tongues could split within generations, diverging with every migration or separation. With populations so small and scattered, languages proliferated like sparks from a fire, each one unique, each one fragile. But agriculture altered the scale of human life. Suddenly, thousands of people could share a common settlement. Granaries and fields demanded coordination. Herds required collective rules, and above all, farmers lived close together, bound by shared work and shared land. Archaeological evidence suggests that population densities skyrocketed with farming. A valley that once supported a few hundred foragers could now feed thousands of cultivators. With larger groups came the need for shared systems of communication. The simplest way to achieve this was for smaller languages to vanish, absorbed into larger tongues that spread across entire regions. Linguistic extinction became a side effect of demographic expansion. Where once each valley might have its own tongue, now an entire river basin might share one. The voices shrank in number, even as they grew in reach. Consider the Fertile Crescent. Archaeology shows a dramatic clustering of people into early agricultural villages around 10,000 years ago. Each village had hundreds of inhabitants, sometimes more. This density would have been unimaginable for forager societies. To function, people needed a common tongue across households, kin groups and lineages. Dialects that might once have thrived in isolation were now pressed together, forced to merge or die. The result was fewer, larger speech communities. Something similar happened in East Asia. Along the Yellow River and the Yangtze, the rise of millet and rice cultivation allowed dense populations. These communities spread, taking their speech with them. Hunter-gatherer groups at the margins either adopted the farmers' language or retreated into areas less suitable for cultivation. Over time, the languages of the farmers dominated the linguistic map. Archaeology does not preserve spoken words, but patterns of expansion and replacement suggest this story played out repeatedly. This shift reveals an important truth. Language is not only a cognitive system but a demographic one. Small populations produce diversity. Large populations produce dominance. It is a balance between fragmentation and consolidation. In the Paleolithic, fragmentation was the rule. In the Neolithic, consolidation began to take over. That balance has shaped the linguistic world we live in today. There is also an ecological dimension to this story. Farming ties people to land. Unlike foragers, who could walk away when resources dwindled, farmers had to defend fields, irrigation systems, and herds. This created new forms of territoriality. A language tied to a territory is harder to displace, but it also spreads farther, because it is spoken by more people over time. Languages became bound not just to groups, but to landscapes. Once again, this encouraged consolidation. Small-scale tongues could not compete with agricultural languages rooted in permanent settlements. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer societies provide a glimpse into what the linguistic landscape may have looked like before farming. Groups like the Hadza of Tanzania or the San of southern Africa speak languages that are highly distinctive, even from their neighbours. In some areas, villages only a few days' walk apart speak mutually unintelligible tongues. This density of diversity is a relic of an older world, one that farming has erased almost everywhere else. The contrast suggests how dramatic the shift must have been 10,000 years ago, when agricultural expansion began swallowing up smaller voices. But humility is required here. We cannot say with certainty exactly how many languages disappeared in the Neolithic. The archaeological record cannot capture vanished words. What we can do is infer patterns from settlement, genetics, and comparisons with modern distribution. The overwhelming likelihood is that linguistic diversity declined as farming expanded. This does not mean that farming tongues were richer or poorer in structure, only that they replaced others. The loss was numerical, not necessarily qualitative. This raises a haunting resolution. Every time a new field was cleared, every time a village grew into a town, a voice may have gone silent. A song, a prayer, a word for a river or a tree may have vanished, never recorded, never remembered. Farming gave us food surpluses, but it may also have cost us a vast library of human expression. The trade-off is difficult to measure, but its effects are still felt today, as the linguistic map of the world remains uneven, shaped by waves of agricultural and demographic expansion that began 10,000 years ago. The haunting question, then, is whether language diversity was the price of civilization. Did the granaries and the fields that sustained larger populations also bury countless tongues beneath them? And if so, what meanings, what ways of seeing the world, were lost forever in the soil we turned to plant the first seeds? How can a word for hand map a family tree? That question sits at the centre of one of the most ambitious projects in human historical linguistics, the attempt to reconstruct the Indo-European language family. This family stretches from the Atlantic coast of Ireland to the mountains of northern India, from the forests of Scandinavia to the deserts of Iran. Its branches include the Romance tongues of Latin descent, the Germanic line that carried Old English to Modern English, the Slavic, Celtic, Hellenic, and Indic traditions, and many others now extinct. What ties them all together are not political boundaries or cultural similarities, but shared words, inherited sounds, and systematic correspondences that cannot be explained by chance. The reveal came in the late 18th century when the British jurist William Jones noticed that Sanskrit, the ancient literary language of India, shared striking similarities with Latin and Greek. Words for kinship, numbers, and basic actions resembled one another so closely that they could only come from a common ancestor. Later linguists confirmed the observation. Once the sound patterns were mapped, it became clear that Sanskrit pitar, Latin pater, and English father were not coincidences but reflections of a deep historical link. The idea that languages could evolve from a shared source, splitting and diverging like biological lineages, was revolutionary. The information that followed was meticulous. Linguists began comparing thousands of words across Indo-European languages. They searched for cognates, words that shared a common origin, and tracked how sounds changed in predictable ways. Grimm's law, for example, described how consonants shifted from Proto-Indo-European to the Germanic branch. What seemed like irregularities in one tongue turned out to be systematic transformations when seen across the family. This method allowed scholars to reconstruct a hypothetical ancestor, the Proto-Indo-European language, spoken perhaps between 7,000 and 5,000 years ago. No written record of it exists, but careful comparison has allowed the creation of word lists, partial grammar, and even plausible sentences. The significance is profound. By tracing shared vocabulary, we can draw family trees of languages much like geneticists map descent through DNA. Words become fossils, preserving echoes of a vanished tongue. The Indo-European case is the most thoroughly studied, not because it is the largest family on Earth, but because it intersects with regions where writing, archaeology, and history overlap. It is a model for how linguistic phylogenies can reveal human prehistory. Yet the haunting question remains: where was Proto-Indo-European spoken? Two competing theories dominate. The first is the Anatolian hypothesis, which places the homeland in what is now Turkey around 9,000 years ago. Proponents argue that the spread of farming carried Indo-European languages across Europe and Asia, piggybacking on demographic growth. The second is the steppe hypothesis, which situates the homeland in the Pontic-Caspian steppe, north of the Black Sea, about 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. According to this view, the expansion of horse-riding pastoralists known from the Yamnaya culture carried the language far and wide. Archaeological finds of wheeled vehicles, burial mounds, and genetic evidence of large-scale migration support this model. Neither hypothesis has been universally accepted. The Anatolian model explains the early spread but struggles with chronology, as some reconstructed Proto-Indo-European words seem to describe wheeled transport, which did not exist 9,000 years ago. The steppe model matches the vocabulary, but leaves open the question of how Indo-European reached regions far from the steppe so rapidly. Genetic data increasingly suggest that steppe migrations played a major role in reshaping the populations of Europe and South Asia during the 3rd millennium BCE, lending weight to the steppe view. But the debate is not over, and humility requires admitting that we may never know the precise homeland with certainty. What is clear is that Indo-Europeans spread in waves, diversifying into branches that continue to split. By comparing word histories, we can estimate when these divergences occurred. For example, the separation between the Italic and Celtic branches seems to date back more than 3,000 years, while the divergence of Indic and Iranian tongues goes back even further. Each split marks migrations, cultural separations, or expansions that carried speech across mountains, rivers, and continents. This linguistic descent with modification mirrors biological evolution. Just as species share common ancestors, so too do languages. Change is constant, but it follows rules. Sound shifts occur in regular patterns, vocabulary is borrowed or replaced, and grammar evolves. By analysing these patterns, linguists can reconstruct trees of descent. The Indo-European case shows that language is not just a cultural artefact, but also a system with lineage, inheritance, and extinction. Entire branches, like Tocharian in western China or Hittite in Anatolia, have vanished, leaving only written records. Others, like Greek or Sanskrit, have survived for millennia in transformed forms. What is perhaps most striking is how everyday words anchor these reconstructions. Terms for body parts, kinship, and numbers are particularly stable. The word for hand, for instance, can be traced across Indo-European branches, linking modern languages to their Proto-Indo-European ancestor. Such words resist borrowing, making them reliable markers of descent. Through them, we glimpse the deep past, hearing echoes of speech from thousands of years ago. Yet we must not romanticize. The Proto-Indo-European language is a reconstruction, an approximation created through comparative method. No one today knows exactly how it sounded. The accent, rhythm, and melody of the speech are lost forever. What we have is a scholarly best guess, useful but incomplete. As with all science, it is provisional, open to revision with new evidence. The haunting resolution is that Indo-European is only one family among many, yet it has shaped much of recorded history. Its spread reflects not just language, but power, migration, and adaptation. Every reconstructed root word is a fossil of human movement, reminding us that our tongues carry history as much as our bones do. And the question lingers: how many other families, unrecorded and unreconstructed, once flourished and vanished without leaving even a trace? Can we track migration by words alone? It is a tempting thought that the stories of where our ancestors walked or sailed can be recovered not only from bones or pottery, but from the syllables that still linger in living mouths. When archaeology fails us, when DNA fades in the soil, language sometimes remains, carrying its own record of expansion. Over the last 5,000 years, two of the clearest cases of this phenomenon unfolded across enormous distances: the Austronesian dispersal across the Pacific and Indian Oceans, and the Bantu expansion across sub-Saharan Africa. Both were vast, transformative, and deeply linguistic. The Austronesian story begins with a cluster of languages in Taiwan. Comparative linguistics has long pointed to this island as the homeland of the family that would eventually stretch from Madagascar off Africa's coast to Rapa Nui in the eastern Pacific, nearly half the circumference of the globe. The pattern is clear. The greatest diversity of Austronesian languages exist in Taiwan, while the further one moves outward into the Pacific or southward into the Indonesian archipelago, the fewer and more closely related the languages become. This is the same principle biologists use to locate a species' point of origin. Diversity is deepest at the centre and thins at the margins. The reveal is astonishing. Beginning perhaps around 5,000 years ago, small groups of seafarers left Taiwan, carrying not only their crops and domestic animals, but their words. Their canoes were equipped with sails, their navigation guided by stars, swells, and bird flight. They colonized the Philippines, then spread into island Southeast Asia, and from there launched into the open Pacific. Each island they reached became a seedbed of new dialects and eventual languages, as isolation and adaptation to local circumstances changed speech. Within a few centuries, distinct tongues were born, but they still carried enough traces of their common heritage to be recognized as part of one vast family. Archaeological evidence supports this linguistic narrative. The Lapita culture, known from its distinctive dentate-stamped pottery, appears around 3,500 years ago in Melanesia and Polynesia. These sites align with the spread of Austronesian-speaking groups. Genetic studies of human remains and even domesticated animals like pigs and chickens also match the dispersal route suggested by language. Yet language often provides the most precise map. By examining shared innovations in vocabulary and sound shifts, linguists can reconstruct the branching order of Austronesian tongues and correlate them with migration stages. The haunting beauty of this story is that words can tell us where canoes once sailed. Even without written records, the very structure of speech preserves a memory of ancient journeys. Polynesian languages, for instance, share cognates that trace back to Proto-Austronesian roots, but they also reveal specific innovations that mark stages of the voyage. These linguistic fingerprints allow us to place communities in relation to each other across thousands of kilometres of ocean. Meanwhile, in Africa, a very different but equally sweeping expansion was underway. Around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, in the region of present-day Cameroon and Nigeria, speakers of a language family we now call Bantu began to spread. Their migrations carried them south and east, eventually reaching as far as South Africa and Kenya, and even across the Channel to Madagascar. Today, more than 500 languages belong to this family, spoken by hundreds of millions of people. The key factor was agriculture and ironworking. The Bantu carried with them crops like yams and oil palms, as well as iron tools that allowed them to clear forests and farm more efficiently than the hunter-gatherers they encountered. Population growth propelled further movement, and with it the languages spread. Just as with Austronesian, the diversity of Bantu languages decreases outward from the homeland, allowing linguists to trace the path of expansion. The parallels between these two cases are striking. Both involve relatively recent timeframes where language divergence can still be measured with clarity. Both involve technological or ecological advantages that fueled demographic growth. Both left linguistic footprints that align with archaeological and genetic evidence. Together, they demonstrate the power of language phylogenies to reconstruct prehistory. But here is the caution. Language trees are not perfect mirrors of human migration. Borrowing, shift, and replacement complicate the picture. Communities can adopt a new language without major genetic change, as happened in Madagascar, where Austronesian speakers merged with African populations. The resulting Malagasy language is Austronesian at its core, but carries Bantu and other influences, a hybrid born of contact. Similarly, some Bantu languages absorbed words from Khoisan tongues, leaving traces of earlier populations now largely replaced. Still, the broad pattern remains robust. The spread of Bantu languages testifies to one of the largest demographic shifts in African history, reshaping the continent's linguistic map. The Austronesian dispersal stands as humanity's greatest maritime expansion before the modern age, carving a network of related tongues across half the globe. Both remind us that languages evolve not in isolation, but through movement, encounter, and adaptation. The information gleaned from these expansions has wider implications. Linguistic phylogenies can be built using methods borrowed from evolutionary biology, treating words like genetic traits that mutate over time. By comparing shared innovations and calculating rates of change, researchers can estimate divergence times. While these estimates are not precise, they offer valuable windows into the tempo of human dispersals. For Austronesian, they suggest rapid movement across vast distances, with languages differentiating in a matter of centuries. For Bantu, the tree reveals steady branching, as populations moved into diverse ecological zones. These insights also reveal something about the resilience of language. Despite distance, the family resemblances endure. A speaker of Hawaiian can still recognize cognates in Maori or Samoan, though separated by thousands of kilometers and centuries of divergence. Bantu speakers across Africa share structural features and vocabulary that reflect their shared ancestry. These connections bind communities to a common past even when politics, geography, and culture divide them. What is haunting is how much has been lost. The Austronesian and Bantu expansions often displaced earlier tongues that are now extinct. We can see hints of these lost languages in loanwords or substrate influences, but most have vanished without a trace. Language, while durable, is also fragile. When speakers shift to new tongues, entire systems of thought can disappear in a single generation. The expansions of the last 5,000 years enriched some linguistic lineages, while silencing countless others. And so we return to the question, can we track migration by words alone? The answer is yes, but with care. Words tell us much, but they must be read alongside archaeology, genetics, and ecology. Taken together, they form a triangulation of human history, each perspective filling gaps left by the others. Alone, language may mislead. Combined, it illuminates. The resolution of this reflection is a recognition of the double nature of language. It is both a marker of identity and a record of movement. It unites people within a community, but also carries the memory of past dispersals. In Austronesian and Bantu, we see how words can cross oceans and forests, adapting and surviving, yet still pointing back to their origins. The haunting question that lingers is this: how many other migrations remain invisible because their languages have vanished? For every Austronesian canoe remembered in Polynesian speech, how many boats left no echo? For every Bantu branch that still flourishes, how many African tongues have dissolved into silence? Language is a map, but it is a map full of blank spaces, where the journeys of forgotten peoples are lost forever. Did we just outsource our last words to machines? For nearly all of human history, language meant sound. Tongues moving in mouths, voices carrying across air, ears catching the vibrations. Now, within only a few short centuries, that dominance has been eroded, and in just the last handful of decades it has been radically reconfigured. The very organ that once defined us, the voice, is no longer the only, nor even the primary medium through which our species shares its thoughts. We have turned from wagging tongues to wiggling thumbs. The reveal is simple but unsettling. The majority of human communication today takes place not through speech, but through text. Every message typed on a screen, every social media post, every search query is a fragment of language now routed through fingertips rather than vocal cords. The mobile phone, a device that is less than half a century old, has reshaped the balance of how we communicate. What once passed across a fire through the warmth of sound now arrives silently through glass and pixels. This shift did not begin with phones, of course. Writing itself was the first great outsourcing of language, a technology invented only about 5,000 years ago. Clay tablets, hieroglyphs, and alphabetic scripts captured speech in durable form, freeing words from the immediacy of the human voice. Writing allowed language to leap across time and space in a way sound never could. A spoken sentence evaporates, a written one lingers. But writing was rare, specialized, and elite for most of history. Even into the last few centuries, the majority of humans lived and died without reading or writing a word. It is only in the modern world that literacy became nearly universal, and with that the balance between spoken and written communication tipped dramatically. The invention of the printing press in the 15th century expanded this reach, multiplying texts in a way previously unimaginable. Books carried language across continents, pamphlets fueled revolutions, newspapers created public spheres of debate. Yet all of this remained primarily in print. The tongue still dominated daily life. Conversations, sermons, songs, and stories were the rhythms of ordinary communication. The radical acceleration came with the telegraph, the typewriter, and eventually the computer. These machines shifted text from a physical inscription to an electrical signal. A thought could be encoded into dots and dashes, carried by wires, reassembled into words miles away. The telephone briefly reclaimed sound, but the internet and the mobile device have returned us firmly to written forms. Today, the text message, the email, the online post vastly outnumber spoken exchanges. By some estimates, trillions of words are typed and sent daily, far exceeding the amount of language spoken aloud. This introduces an existential question. If language evolved for face-to-face cooperation, what does it mean that we now communicate more through silent keystrokes than living voices? The intimacy of speech, its tone, pauses, emphasis, and rhythm, is stripped away. In its place, we add emoticons, GIFs, and images, attempts to approximate the expressiveness of a human face or voice. The irony is that we are returning in a way to visual communication, the very precursor of language itself. Before words, our ancestors likely relied heavily on gesture and sign. Today, we send emojis and memes. The arc of language seems to bend back on itself. The science of this transition is still unfolding. Linguists note that digital writing is not quite writing in the traditional sense. It is closer to what some call secondary orality, text that imitates the immediacy of speech. A tweet or a text message is often conversational in tone, filled with abbreviations, slang, and rhythmical punctuation. It is writing that wants to sound like talking. We even punctuate silence with 3 dots as if to recreate a pause. In this sense, digital text is not replacing speech but mutating it into a new hybrid form. The deeper implication is that language is no longer bound to air or ink. It is now mediated through algorithms. Every message typed into a phone is stored, analysed, and sometimes manipulated. Language has always been social, but never before has it been so systematically tracked. This raises a question. Are we still speaking for one another, or are we increasingly speaking for the machines that sort and serve our words back to us? Take predictive text. Every time you type, your device anticipates what you mean. It suggests the next word, the next phrase. Already, millions of human utterances are co-authored with algorithms. Some scholars wonder if this marks a new evolutionary stage, where language is not only a product of human brains, but of human-machine symbiosis. If our ancestors once invented speech by shaping air with tongues, are we now inventing a new kind of language by shaping text with thumbs guided by artificial memory? We should be careful not to romanticize the past. Spoken language was never pure or simple. It was messy, filled with misunderstandings, arguments, and ambiguities. Written language did not kill speech. It supplemented it. The same is true of digital communication. People still talk, laugh, sing, and argue out loud, but the balance is shifting, and the cumulative weight of trillions of typed exchanges cannot be ignored. For future archaeologists, the greatest record of our era will not be bones or pottery, but databases of words. There is also the matter of scale. Never before has a single human been able to broadcast language to millions in an instant. A tweet, a video caption, a viral meme can travel faster and farther than any spoken speech in history. This global amplification transforms language into something both fragile and overwhelming. Fragile, because meaning can be distorted or lost in transmission. Overwhelming, because the flood of words is constant, unrelenting, and often exhausting. The human brain evolved for village-sized conversations. It now confronts planetary-scale dialogues. This brings us to the haunting resolution. What part of language will outlast us? If our species vanishes, what will remain? Carved stone inscriptions may endure, as will some digital archives if they survive data rot and obsolescence. But the living voice, the warmth of sound across a fire, may disappear without a trace. Already thousands of spoken languages are endangered, some with only a handful of elderly speakers left. When those voices fall silent, a unique way of seeing the world is gone. Writing can preserve some fragments, but the cadence, the tone, the music of speech is harder to keep. Perhaps then the story of language is not a straight line from grunts to grammar to global text, but a cycle of shifting mediums, from gesture to speech, from speech to writing, from writing to digital, and maybe someday to something else entirely. Bio-digital implants, brain-to-brain interfaces, or forms we cannot yet imagine. Each stage outsources a little more of the burden from the human body to external systems, from tongues to thumbs, and perhaps soon from thumbs to thought alone. The haunting question is whether in outsourcing we risk losing the essence. Did we invent language to connect, or have we now created a world where our words are so multiplied and fragmented that they no longer bind us together, but push us apart? If the last human words are typed rather than spoken, will that matter? Maybe not. Maybe what matters is that meaning continues, regardless of the channel. But there is also something irreplaceable in the breath of another person's voice. So we end where we began. Did we just outsource our last words to machines? The answer is uncertain. What we do know is that language, like us, never stands still. It adapts, reshapes, fragments, and recombines. If there is a future species looking back on us, they may find our databases of digital text and call it language. They may see our memes and emojis and call them hieroglyphs. Or they may find nothing at all, and the only surviving trace will be the silence of servers long shut down. But for now, as you read these words on a glowing screen, transmitted not by my tongue but by my fingers across a keyboard, you are part of this ongoing story. The tongue has not fallen silent, but it no longer reigns alone. The thumb, the screen, and the machine are now equal partners in the shaping of human meaning, and the true mystery is not whether this is decline or progress, but simply whether anything of us will still be understandable once the voices fall silent and only the text remains. Thank you, fellow sapiens, for wandering this timeline with me, for drifting into deep time, for slowing down and remembering. If this helped you fall asleep, helped you study, or simply helped you step out of the noise for a while, thank you for being here. If you think more people should know this story, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, share it with the sapiens in your life, and tell me, are you listening before bed, while working, or somewhere in the world I can only imagine? And as always, stay curious, stay calm. I'll see you in the next story.